Hey, welcome back, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are right now, maybe curled up in bed, maybe stretched out on the couch, maybe hiding from the chaos of your day in the one quiet corner of your home, I want you to take a slow breath with me. In and out. Good. Tonight we're going somewhere unexpected together, and I promise you, by the time this story's done, you will never look at the word hospital quite the same way again. Here is something I want you to picture. You are sick. Not just a little under the weather, truly deeply sick. And someone points you toward the nearest hospital. You walk through the door, and the first thing you hear is singing. Not machines beeping, not nurses rushing down hallways, not the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors. Singing. Low, slow, beautiful chanting, like the inside of a cathedral at dusk. Because that is exactly what a medieval hospital was. Not a clinic. Not even close. It was quite literally the house of God. And the people who built it believed that if you wanted to heal the body, you had to start with the soul. Now, if that sounds strange to you, just wait. Because the stranger part is this: by some measures it actually worked. And before we go any further, I just want to say, if this kind of slow, quiet storytelling is your thing, if you like falling asleep to history that actually makes you think, would you consider subscribing to this channel and dropping a like on this video? Not because I am asking you to press a button, but because every time you do it tells the universe that stories like this one deserve to exist. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this tonight in bed on your couch? Tell me in the comments. Or if you just feel like leaving a kind word, I promise I will read every single one. It means more than you know. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft white noise. Let your shoulders drop and let us go back together about 900 years. Let us start with something that will genuinely surprise you. Between the Norman conquest in the year 1066 and the middle of the 16th century, over 700 hospitals were founded across England alone. 700. In a country whose entire population never exceeded 4 million people during this period. That is one hospital for roughly every 5,000 people. And before you picture anything resembling a modern medical facility, I need to gently set that image aside. Because the word hospital did not mean what we think it means. It comes from the Latin word hospitalis, which means at its root simply being concerned with guests. Guests, strangers, travellers, anyone who needed shelter. The medieval hospital was not primarily a place to be cured, it was a place to be received. Now I want you to really sit with that for a moment because it changes everything. We live in an age where we go to the hospital expecting answers, expecting diagnoses, treatments, discharge papers, a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. We expect to leave better than we arrived, and if we do not, something has gone wrong. But in medieval Europe, that expectation simply did not exist. Medicine as we understand it, the germ theory of disease, the understanding that bacteria cause infections, the idea that you could surgically remove something and the person might actually survive, none of that existed. It would not arrive for centuries. What people did have was something else entirely: the deep, sincere belief that suffering was spiritual in nature. That sickness was connected to sin, and that the most powerful medicine available was not a herb or a tincture or a bloodletting, but prayer. This was not ignorance dressed up as religion. This was a completely coherent worldview, and the institutions built around it were by the standards of their time genuinely sophisticated. The first dedicated hospitals in England emerged in the late 11th century, and they were almost entirely the creation of the Church. One of the earliest and most significant was St. John's Hospital in Canterbury, founded around the year 1070 by Archbishop Lanfranc. the very same man who oversaw the construction of Canterbury Cathedral. Lanfranc established this institution to give what his own writings described as 24-hour care to men and women, quote, oppressed by various kinds of infirmities. 24-hour care in the 11th century. Just down the road from St. John's, Lanfranc also established a separate facility specifically for lepers, a group we will spend much more time with later in this series. But even in these two early institutions, you can already see the shape of the entire medieval hospital system, forming one place for the treatable, one place for those who could not be cured, but could be cared for. This distinction between healing and caring is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about how the medieval world approached suffering. They were far more honest about it than we sometimes are. They did not pretend that everyone who walked through the door would walk out well. They simply promised that no one would face what was coming alone. Now here is where things get genuinely fascinating. The medieval hospital was not just one kind of place. It was a whole spectrum of institutions, each with a slightly different purpose, each serving a slightly different need. And understanding these differences is what really opens up the world we're exploring tonight. At one end of the spectrum, you had the large pilgrimage hospitals. These were essentially inns for holy travellers, people making long journeys to sacred sites like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela or Rome. They were places to sleep, to eat, to rest sore feet. The hospitality was real and often generous, but it was understood to be temporary. You stayed one night, maybe two, and then you moved on. At the other end of the spectrum, you had institutions that functioned much more like what we might recognize as long-term care facilities. These were places for the elderly who could no longer care for themselves, for people with chronic conditions, for the permanently disabled. They did not leave. This was in every meaningful sense their home for the rest of their lives, and in the middle, overlapping with both ends in various ways, you had the true hospitals, places where the sick came, where they were examined, where treatments were attempted, and where some of them, against all the odds of medieval medicine, actually got better. But here is the thing that ties all of these places together, the single thread running through every single one of them, whether it was a grand stone building in London or a tiny two-room cottage in a small market town. They were all, every single one, called by the same names. In Latin, Domus Dei, the house of God. In French, Maison Dieu, God's house. In English, sometimes simply God's house. And that name was not metaphorical. It was architectural. It was structural. It was built into the very design of these places in a way that you would notice the moment you walk through the door. Because in a medieval hospital of any significant size, the central feature, the heart of the whole building, was not the ward. It was not the kitchen or the herb garden or the physician's room. It was the chapel. Imagine it. You're a patient. You've been admitted to one of these institutions. You've been shown to your bed, and you look up from where you are lying and you can see the altar. Not because someone hung a cross on the wall as a gesture of comfort, but because the ward and the chapel were in the largest hospital's literally one connected space. The beds lined the long walls of the nave, the same way pews would line the nave of a church, and the altar stood at the far end, raised slightly candlelit present. Every time a service was held, and services were held multiple times every single day, you heard it from your bed. The prayers washed over you. The incense drifted through the air. The chanting was constant, rhythmic, as reliable as the rising of the sun. A historian studying medieval hospitals once observed that if you were to walk into one of these buildings today not knowing what it was, you would look around and think, this is a church. It looks like a church. It smells like a church. It acts like a church. Because in the minds of the people who built it, that was exactly what it was. And here is the part that I find most quietly remarkable about this whole system. The people who funded these hospitals The kings and bishops and wealthy merchants who paid for the stone and the timber and the endowments were not doing it purely out of generosity. They were doing it, at least in part, for themselves. In the medieval Christian worldview, one of the most powerful things a rich person could do to improve their chances of getting into heaven was to perform what were called the 7 corporal works of mercy. And near the top of that list, right alongside feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, was visiting the sick. Building a hospital and paying for its ongoing operation was essentially an act of spiritual investment. You were purchasing prayers. Every patient in that building was obligated, in many cases formally and by contract, to pray for the soul of the founder, day after day, year after year, for as long as the institution existed. It sounds strange to us now, but think about it from inside that worldview for just a moment. If you genuinely believed that the prayers of the poor and the suffering had particular power before God, if you genuinely believed that your own soul's fate might be softened by the gratitude of people you had helped, then building a hospital was not charity in the modern sense of the word. It was an investment strategy, a rather clever one when you think about it. Now, by the later Middle Ages, this system had grown into something remarkable in scale. London alone had approximately 35 hospitals. York had about the same number. Norwich had 15, Exeter had 10, Canterbury had 9. And these were not all large institutions. Many were modest, some were barely bigger than a single-family home. But they existed. They were woven into the fabric of urban life, and across France the numbers were similarly striking. In the Diocese of Grenoble alone there were approximately 54 hospitals by the close of the 15th century. In the city of Toulouse, home to about 25,000 people at the time, 15 separate hospitals served the population. Think about that for just a moment. 15 hospitals for 25,000 people. That is not nothing. That is a genuine civic infrastructure built not by the state, not by any government program, but by a combination of religious obligation, personal ambition, genuine compassion, and yes, the very human desire to be remembered well after you are gone. But here is the question I want to leave hanging in the air for just a moment before we move deeper into this world. If these places were so widespread, so carefully built, so thoroughly integrated into medieval society, why do we know so little about what actually happened inside them? The answer, it turns out, is hiding in plain sight. Most medieval hospitals looked exactly like churches, and during the Reformation in the 16th century, when King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and seized their assets, a huge portion of these institutions simply disappeared. The buildings were repurposed or torn down. The records were scattered. The traditions were broken. What survived, and this is what makes the ones that did survive so precious, are fragments, household accounts, admission registers, rules and regulations written on parchment, archaeological remains, the occasional letter or chronicle that happened to mention what daily life was like inside. And from those fragments, historians have assembled something extraordinary, a picture of a world where medicine and faith were completely inseparable, where the boundaries between inn and hospital and almshouse and church were deliberately blurred, where people came not just to be healed, but to be witnessed in their suffering. The Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester, founded around the year 1132 by Bishop Henry de Blois, and still standing today, still operating, which is itself a kind of miracle, gives us one of the clearest windows into what these places were trying to do. Its founder specified that it would provide permanent housing for 13 poor men who were so physically weak, in his words, that they rarely or never could stand without assistance. 13. That number is not accidental. It echoes the Last Supper Christ and his 12 disciples, the founding image of Christian hospitality. And beyond its 13 permanent residents, St. Cross also provided a daily meal at its gates to 100 other poor people from the surrounding area. Not residents, not patients, just people who showed up hungry and were fed. That practice, that extraordinary, quietly radical practice, continued for centuries. And here is the truly remarkable part. It still continues today. If you visit the Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester, you can still ask at the gate for what is called the Wayfarer's Dole, a small piece of bread and a tiny cup of ale. It has been offered to passing strangers without charge, without condition, for nearly 900 years. 900 years. I think that detail, that one small, stubborn, beautiful detail, tells us more about the spirit of the medieval hospital than any academic account possibly could. These were not perfect places. We will talk about the suffering that happened inside them, the corruption, the beds shared between strangers, the treatments that did more harm than good, the rules that were harsh and sometimes cruel. But underneath all of that, at the foundation of the whole enormous, complicated, flawed, magnificent system, was this A door that stayed open, bread that was given freely. The belief held with complete sincerity that the person who arrived at your gate hungry or sick or dying was not a problem to be managed. They were, in the language of the time, a guest of God, and you as the keeper of this house were simply the host. There is so much more waiting for us inside these walls, because we have only just stepped through the door. In just a moment, we're going to find out something that most people never think to ask, not what happened once you were admitted, but what it actually took to get admitted in the first place. Because it turns out getting into a medieval hospital was far more complicated and far more revealing about medieval society than you might ever expect. Some people were welcomed with open arms. Others were turned away at the gate no matter how desperately they needed help. And the reasons why tell us something important, not just about the past, but about every system of care that has ever existed, including our own. Stay with me. So let me ask you something. If you had to guess, right now, just off the top of your head, who do you think was most likely to be turned away from a medieval hospital? The violent, the contagious, the desperately poor? Well, the answer is more complicated than you might expect, and honestly more uncomfortable too. Because the admission process of a medieval hospital reveals something that feels very modern once you look closely at it. These places built in the name of Christian mercy, built in the name of God's unconditional love, they had gatekeepers, they had criteria, they had lists of people they simply would not accept. And the logic behind those lists tells you an enormous amount about how medieval society actually worked underneath all the beautiful idealism. Let us start with what the rules looked like on paper. Most larger hospitals operated with a formal set of statutes, written documents often issued by the founding bishop or patron that spelled out exactly who qualified for admission. Historians who have studied these statutes across England, France and Italy find a pattern that repeats again and again with striking consistency. The typical list of exclusions went something like this: epileptics not admitted, the mentally unstable not admitted, people with contagious conditions not admitted, lepers not admitted, they had their own separate institutions, pregnant women frequently not admitted, especially if unmarried, anyone with an incurable condition that showed no prospect of recovery in many places not admitted. Now read that list again. These were by definition the people who needed help the most. There is a tension at the heart of this that I've been thinking about since I first started researching this series, and I want to share it with you plainly. Medieval hospitals were genuinely charitable. The people who built them, the people who staffed them, the people who gave money to keep them running, many of them were sincere. They truly believed they were doing God's work. And yet, the moment you start excluding epileptics and the mentally unwell and pregnant unmarried women, You're no longer running a house of unconditional mercy. You're running a curated institution shaped by the social anxieties and moral judgments of its time. Epilepsy in the medieval worldview carried a heavy shadow of superstition. Seizures were frightening to witness. They were sometimes interpreted as signs of spiritual corruption of demonic influence, and a hospital ward full of frightened sick people lying in close quarters was not considered the right place to introduce that kind of visible dramatic suffering. Mental illness was similarly misunderstood in ways that could be genuinely dangerous. Someone experiencing severe psychosis in a small crowded ward was practically speaking a serious disruption. The hospital masters who wrote these exclusions were not monsters. They were in many cases making pragmatic decisions about institutions that had limited space-limited staff and very few tools for managing complex behavioral situations. This does not make the exclusions right, but it makes them human, and that to me is what makes history worth studying. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Some hospitals, in open defiance of the general trend, specialised in exactly the populations that everyone else refused. St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, founded in the year 1123 by a man named Rahere, who was of all things a court jester turned monk after a near-death experience on a pilgrimage to Rome, became known across the city for a policy that would have raised eyebrows almost anywhere else in medieval England. St Bartholomew's specifically offered care to what one contemporary account described as young women who had misdone, meaning in the careful language of the time unmarried women who were pregnant. At a moment when most hospitals would turn such a woman away at the door, St Bartholomew's let her in. Think about what that meant in practical terms. An unmarried pregnant woman in medieval London had almost no safety net. Her family might have disowned her. She had no legal standing to demand support from the father. She could not work in most respectable trades. She was in almost every social sense on her own. And yet here was this hospital, founded by a former court jester, which is itself a detail I find endlessly charming, opening its doors specifically to her. I think about Rahere sometimes. A man who spent his career making kings laugh, who nearly died of fever on a pilgrimage, who had what he described as a vision of St Bartholomew, calling him to build a place of healing, and who built in the heart of London something that lasted 9 centuries. Not bad for a jester. The question of who paid for admission adds another fascinating layer to this story. We tend to imagine medieval hospitals as purely charitable enterprises, places where the doors opened freely to anyone in need, and some of them genuinely were. The poorest patients, the true paupers, the wandering sick with nothing to their name. Many hospitals did receive them without payment of any kind, relying entirely on endowments and donations to cover their care. But alongside this free admission, a second system operated quietly and simultaneously. Wealthy people, or people with enough means to arrange it, could purchase what was sometimes called a corrody. This was essentially a contractual arrangement. You paid a lump sum to the hospital, either in money or in land, and in return you received a guaranteed bed, meals and care for the rest of your life. It was in every meaningful sense a medieval retirement plan, and the hospitals needed these arrangements desperately because running a charitable institution is expensive in any century. The corrody payments helped subsidize the care of those who could not pay at all. The wealthy resident and the pauper lying in the next bed were in a strange way financially linked, one's money keeping the other alive. There is even evidence of people purchasing what amounted to a title to a specific bed. Not just a place in the hospital generally, but this particular bed with its particular view of the altar, its particular proximity to the fire. A bed you could pass on to a friend or a family member after your death. Buying property in a medieval hospital. I genuinely could not make that up. But the admission story that stops me cold every time. The one that reveals the most raw truth about how these places worked involves a category of patient that does not fit neatly into any of our modern categories. The medieval hospital, in a number of documented cases, admitted people who were not sick in any physical sense at all. They were simply old and alone and had nowhere else to go. Elderly residents, people historians sometimes call the aged poor, formed a significant portion of the population in many almshouses and hospital-adjacent institutions. They had not fallen ill in any acute way. They had simply outlived their usefulness in the medieval economy, outlived their family support networks, outlived the social structures that had sustained them through their working years, and the medieval world, to its credit, recognized that this too was a form of need worthy of response. One set of hospital statutes from 13th century England describes the ideal admission candidate as a person who is in need through poverty or age or weakness, even if there be no disease present. No disease present, just poverty, just age, just the kind of invisible, slow-moving vulnerability that does not announce itself dramatically, that does not bleed visibly, that requires a different kind of attention than the person writhing with fever. I think about that phrase sometimes when I read about debates over elder care in the modern world. The medieval world, for all its limitations, understood something that we still struggle with, that the need to be cared for does not require a diagnosis. Now, once you were admitted, however you got in whatever category you fell into, there was a ceremony. And the ceremony matters, because it tells us something about how the medieval hospital understood what it was doing and who was crossing its threshold. In many institutions, new patients did not simply walk in and get shown to a bed. They were formally received. There was a ritual. It varied from place to place, but the common thread was this. The new arrival was brought before the altar or to a specific part of the chapel, and prayers were said over them. Sometimes the master of the hospital laid hands on them. Sometimes they were given a specific garment to wear, a robe or a cloak that marked them as residents of this particular house. They were being, in a very literal sense, inducted into a community, because that is what the hospital was, not a service you accessed, a community you joined. And joining came with obligations as well as privileges. The resident was expected to pray at the appointed hours, to behave in accordance with the house rules, to treat the other residents with respect, to participate in the life of the institution. A new arrival was not a customer. They were something closer to a new member of a household. With all the warmth and all the strictness that implies, here is a detail I find quietly moving. At some English hospitals, the admission ceremony included a specific prayer for the person being received. Not a generic prayer for the sick, but one tailored to acknowledge the particular vulnerability of someone who had arrived needing help. One such prayer preserved in a document from a medieval English hospital asked God to receive this person as you received the stranger who came to you with nothing, an explicit echo of the parable of the prodigal son the wanderer welcomed home, not because he deserved it, but simply because he came. That theology, the idea that need itself is sufficient justification for welcome, sat right at the heart of the whole system, and it existed alongside the exclusion lists, alongside the corridees, alongside the politics and the corruption, and the bishops who sent their retired servants to take up beds that were supposed to be for the desperately poor. Both things were true simultaneously. The ideal and the reality living in the same building, sleeping in the same ward, which is, when you think about it, a fairly accurate description of every institution humans have ever built. One more thing I want to leave with you from this part of the story before we move inside the walls and start looking at what daily life actually felt like for the people who lived there. The physical act of crossing the threshold of a medieval hospital was for many people a final crossing, not because they necessarily died there, though many did, but because the world they came from and the world inside operated by completely different rules. Outside, you were defined by your work, your family, your guild, your place in the social hierarchy. You were a weaver's widow, a retired soldier, a merchant's aging father. Your identity was tied entirely to your function in the world. Inside, you were first and foremost a soul in need of care. That shift from being defined by what you could do to being received simply for who you were was not a small thing. For some people, it must have felt like relief so profound it was almost unbearable. For others, it must have felt like erasure. Both responses make complete sense to me, and I suspect if you think about it honestly, they probably make sense to you too. We've been standing in the doorway long enough. It is time to go inside. Because once the admission ceremony was over, once the prayers had been said, and the bed had been assigned, a patient in a medieval hospital entered a world governed by a daily rhythm so precise, so structured, so completely different from anything we experience today, that understanding it changes the way you hear everything else about this story. We are about to find out what an ordinary day actually looked like. The bells that told you when to sleep and when to wake and when to eat and when to pray. The person who visited your bedside twice a day carrying a small clay pot and an expression of professional concern. The meals that were prescribed not for taste or preference, but for what medieval medicine believed they would do to your blood. And one particular story, involving a very clever monk, a very suspicious king, and a very unexpected diagnosis, that I think you're going to remember for a long time. Stay close. The bells started before dawn. Not a gentle chime, not a soft distant sound you could roll over and ignore. A full insistent ringing that cut through the darkness of the ward and reached every single bed simultaneously. And when those bells rang, whether you were feverish, whether you were exhausted, whether every bone in your body ached, you were expected to be awake. Welcome to a typical morning in a medieval hospital, where the day did not belong to you. It belonged to a schedule that had been running more or less unchanged for generations. I want to walk you through that day, hour by hour, not as a list of facts, but as an experience. Because when you actually feel the rhythm of it, the way time moved inside those walls, something shifts in your understanding of what these places really were. The canonical hours. That is what governed everything. For those unfamiliar with the term, and do not worry, I had to look this up myself the first time, the canonical hours were a set of fixed prayer times, observed by the Catholic Church throughout the day and night. There were 8 of them spread from roughly 2 in the morning until sunset and beyond. Matins before dawn, lauds at first light, prime at sunrise, terce sext, none through the morning and midday, vespers at dusk, compline at the close of day. 8 times the bells rang, 8 times the ward shifted into a mode of prayer and observation, and this was not optional, in a hospital that was also architecturally a chapel, which, as we discussed, most of them were. The patients in their beds were not merely listening to religious services happening somewhere nearby. They were inside the service. They were part of it. The prayers being sung were in a very real sense being sung over them. Think about what that would feel like. Lying in a bed genuinely unwell and hearing the same rhythmic chanting 8 times a day every day for however long you stayed. Some people found it deeply comforting, the constancy of it, the sense that the world continued its sacred rotation regardless of your suffering. Others, I suspect, found it exhausting in a way they would never have been permitted to say out loud. Between the prayers there was eating, and the food deserves its own moment of attention because it was nothing like what you might expect. Meals in a medieval hospital were not designed for pleasure. They were designed as medicine. This requires a brief detour into how medieval people understood the body, and I promise it is genuinely interesting, not just a dry bit of medical history. The dominant medical framework of the Middle Ages was humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek thinkers and transmitted through centuries of scholarly commentary. The basic idea was this: the human body contained 4 essential fluids called humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance between them. Illness was what happened when one humour became excessive or deficient, and crucially, diet was considered one of the primary tools for correcting that imbalance. So when a patient arrived at a medieval hospital, the people caring for them were not just trying to make them comfortable. They were trying to recalibrate the internal chemistry of the body through carefully chosen food. Certain foods were considered hot or cold, moist or dry, and prescribing the right combination was seen as genuinely therapeutic. Mutton, for example, was considered broadly beneficial for a wide range of conditions, which is why multiple hospital account books from England and France show mutton appearing on the menu with almost comic regularity regardless of what was actually wrong with the patient. Mutton for the feverish, mutton for the recovering, mutton for the elderly, mutton for essentially everyone. If you were a medieval hospital patient and you loved lamb, you were probably quite happy. If you were not, well, medicine rarely tastes good in any century. Beyond mutton, the standard diet in most English hospitals of the 13th and 14th centuries included bread, and the quality of this bread was taken seriously. White bread made from finely milled wheat flour was considered more digestible and more appropriate for the sick than the coarser brown bread eaten by ordinary labourers. Getting white bread in a hospital was not a luxury. It was a medical prescription. Pottage featured heavily as well. This was a thick, slow-cooked stew of vegetables, legumes, and often a small amount of meat, the medieval equivalent of the kind of soup your grandmother makes when you're unwell. Simple, warm filling, easy on a weakened digestive system. Fish appeared regularly, particularly on the numerous fast days mandated by the church calendar. Medieval Christians were expected to abstain from meat on Fridays and on various other days throughout the religious year, and hospitals, being deeply embedded in church life, observed these fasts faithfully. So fish was not merely on the menu. It was structurally required on a significant number of days each week. Ale was served at most hospitals, including to patients. Do not let that surprise you too much. In the medieval world, ale was a nutritional staple as much as a drink. It provided calories and hydration in a form that was considerably safer than untreated water, which could carry all manner of waterborne illness. A small ale with meals was by the medical understanding of the time genuinely beneficial. Some larger, better endowed hospitals also provided wine, again not as an indulgence but as treatment. Wine was considered warming and strengthening, appropriate for patients recovering from weakness or blood loss. Now, the monk, the king, and the urine. I promised you this story at the end of the last part, and I have been saving it, because it is one of my favourite small windows into medieval medical practice. The primary diagnostic tool of the medieval hospital physician, or infirmarius, the monk or nun responsible for medical care, was uroscopy, the examination of urine. This sounds crude to modern ears and perhaps a little amusing, but it was within its own framework a surprisingly sophisticated practice. The colour, clarity, smell, and even taste of a patient's urine was believed to reveal an enormous amount about the internal state of their humours. Experienced practitioners could identify fever, kidney problems, certain nutritional deficiencies in pregnancy, all from examining a small clay pot of urine held up to the light. The infirmarius typically made rounds twice a day. They would move from bed to bed, each patient having set out their urine for examination, and the practitioner would assess each sample carefully before discussing the patient's condition, adjusting their diet prescription, and in some cases preparing an herbal remedy. Now, the story. Notker II was the abbot of the monastery of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland in the late 9th century. He was known as a skilled practitioner of uroscopy, someone genuinely good at reading the signs that urine offered. One day, King Henry I of Bavaria, who was apparently the kind of monarch who enjoyed testing people, sent Notker a flask of urine, not his own, a chambermaid's. He wanted to see whether this celebrated monk would fall for the ruse and deliver an embarrassing false diagnosis for a king who was in fact perfectly healthy. Notker examined the flask. He considered it for a long moment, and then he sent back his verdict. He told the king, and I love this detail, that God was about to perform a miracle, because according to his examination the king was about to give birth within 30 days. He had correctly identified the chambermaid's pregnancy from her urine alone and turned the trick back on the king with such elegant precision that the story was recorded and repeated for centuries afterward. That is a man who knew what he was doing, and it is a reminder that medieval medicine, for all its genuine limitations, was not simply superstition with herbs. It was a careful practiced discipline built on centuries of accumulated observation, operating within a theoretical framework that was wrong in its foundations, but sometimes startlingly accurate in its practical conclusions. The infirmarius was in most hospitals the closest thing to what we would recognize as a doctor, but the role was layered in ways that have no modern equivalent. This person, often a senior monk or an experienced lay brother, visited each patient twice daily. The morning visit assessed overnight changes and set the dietary prescription for the day. The evening visit checked on progress-adjusted treatments, and in cases of serious decline had a particular additional responsibility, ensuring that the patient had received the sacrament of confession. Because in medieval medical thinking the spiritual and physical were not merely connected. They were the same thing looked at from different angles. Multiple hospital statutes from across Europe explicitly required that patients who refused confession also be refused further medical treatment. This was not cruelty. It was a genuinely held belief that sin was in a literal sense a cause of physical illness, and that no treatment of the body could be effective if the underlying spiritual condition was left unaddressed. There is something I find unexpectedly moving about this, even as I recognize how problematic it was in practice. The medieval infirmarius was not just asking what hurts. They were asking with complete sincerity, what is broken in your life that might be connected to what is broken in your body. It was a holistic medicine that we would now recognize as addressing mental and emotional states alongside physical ones, even if the specific mechanism they believed in was entirely incorrect. Let us talk about what happened in the ward at night. After Compline, the final prayer of the day usually around 7 or 8 in the evening, the hospital entered what was known as the Great Silence. Talking was forbidden, or at least strongly discouraged in many institutions. The lights were reduced. The ward settled into the particular hush of a large room full of people trying to find rest. And here is something that took me by surprise when I first encountered it in many hospitals. Patients shared beds. Not merely beds in the same room, the same physical bed, 2 or sometimes 3 people lying alongside each other under a shared blanket. At the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, one of the largest and most documented hospitals of the medieval world, operating continuously from the 7th century onward, this practice was standard well into the 15th century. Records from the very late 1400s describe the ward containing beds for just over 300 people, accommodating more than 600 patients simultaneously, 2 to a bed, sometimes more in cases of overflow. By modern standards, this sounds alarming. And from the perspective of infection control, it genuinely was. People with different conditions lying in physical contact with one another, created conditions for the spread of illness that we would now recognize as deeply problematic. But the medieval world did not have germ theory. What they had instead was a different set of concerns. Cold was dangerous, warmth was therapeutic, sharing body heat was within their medical framework actually beneficial. The fear was not of transmission between patients. The fear was of the chill, and in a stone building in winter in a century without central heating, that fear was entirely reasonable. The beds themselves were better than you might expect, at least in the larger, better-funded hospitals. Historical records and a handful of surviving inventories describe hospital beds with actual mattresses, typically filled with straw, sometimes with wool or feathers in wealthier establishments. Linen sheets changed regularly, a bolster for the head. Cleanliness, in fact, was taken more seriously in medieval hospitals than the popular image of the dirty Middle Ages might suggest. Several hospital statutes explicitly required that sheets be washed at regular intervals, sometimes as frequently as every 2 weeks, which was considerably more often than ordinary people washed their household linens. The floors of wards were to be swept and strewn with fresh rushes. Personal hygiene was attended to. Patients were expected to be bathed periodically, their hair and beards trimmed. One English hospital's rules stated specifically that the bedding of a deceased patient must be laundered before being used again, which tells you that the practice of reuse was standard, but also that some level of ritual cleansing between occupants was required. These were not the filthy, neglected spaces of nightmare. They were within their era genuinely cared for. The people who ran them believed that a clean environment was part of the treatment. They were right about that, even if they had no idea why. There is one more element of daily hospital life that I want to spend a moment on before we move forward, because it reveals something important about the texture of these places. The herb garden. Almost every hospital of any size maintained one. Tucked against a south-facing wall or laid out in careful beds in an inner courtyard, the hospital garden was not decorative. It was pharmaceutical. The plants grown there, and historians have reconstructed these gardens from account books, from monastic herbals, from occasional inventories, included a remarkable range of medicinal species. Sage, which was considered broadly strengthening and was used in a tea-like preparation for fevers. Feverfew used specifically for headaches and what we might now recognize as migraines. Valerian prescribed as a sleep aid, and which modern pharmacology has confirmed does indeed contain compounds that affect the central nervous system. Rue used for digestive complaints. Comfrey applied topically to bruises and swellings. Some of these treatments worked. Some did not. Some were neutral. A small number were genuinely harmful. Pennyroyal, for example, which was sometimes prescribed for menstrual disorders, is in sufficient concentration toxic, but the garden as a whole represents something important: the medieval hospital's commitment to active intervention. These were not institutions that simply put patients in beds and prayed over them while waiting for nature to take its course. They were actively trying to influence outcomes. They were experimenting, observing, passing down knowledge from one generation of practitioners to the next. They were doing medicine, imperfect, pre-scientific, sometimes dangerously wrong medicine, but medicine nonetheless. Something about the daily rhythm of these places strikes me as worthy of reflection before we leave this part of the story. In a medieval hospital, time was structured entirely around collective experience. You woke when the bells woke everyone. You ate when everyone ate. You prayed when everyone prayed. You slept when the silence fell over the whole ward. There was very little private time in any meaningful sense, very little space to be merely an individual. And yet, and I find this genuinely interesting, the historical evidence suggests that many long-term residents adapted to this rhythm with something approaching gratitude. Accounts from almshouse residents Letters the occasional chronicle. They describe the regularity as comforting, the bells as orienting, the shared meals as a form of companionship that many of them had lacked entirely before entering. When you have been living alone in poverty, without enough food, without certainty about tomorrow, the sound of a bell that means dinner is ready can feel like grace. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. We've spent time today inside the ordinary rhythms of these places. The bells, the meals, the urine pots, the shared beds, the gardens, the particular exhausted silence after Compline. But we've been looking so far at the relatively stable inhabitants, the long-term residents, the people who had time to settle into the rhythm. What we have not yet talked about are the people who arrived in crisis, who came through those doors not for slow-managed decline, but because something had gone acutely urgently wrong. Because the next part of this story takes us somewhere quite different, into the wards that dealt with a category of suffering so visible, so feared and so profoundly misunderstood that the medieval world built an entire parallel system of care just to contain it. A system with its own rules, its own geography, its own strange and complicated dignity. And the story of how those people lived, what their days actually looked like, what they ate, what they were permitted and what they were forbidden, is one of the most surprising things I have found in all of this research. Keep listening. Picture a road leading out of a medieval town. Any town, Canterbury, Paris, Bologna, Cologne. The year does not matter much. Pick any century between the 11th and the 14th. As you walk that road away from the town centre, past the market and the church and the tanner's yard with its permanent eye-watering smell, you will eventually come to a building set deliberately apart from everything else. Not hidden exactly, but separate, placed outside the walls near enough to be reachable, far enough to communicate something unmistakable. This place is not for you, unless of course it is. Because if you carried the particular condition that medieval society feared above almost all others, if your skin had begun to change, if you had noticed the telltale numbness in your fingers, or the thickening of your brow, or the slowly spreading patches on your arms, then this building was in a strange and complicated way your destination. The leprosarium, the leper house, the House of St. Lazarus, as many of them were called, invoking the biblical figure of the diseased beggar raised from the dead at the gates of a rich man's home. And what happened inside it, what daily life actually looked like, what it felt like to live there, what the people who entered those walls were permitted and forbidden, feared and protected, is one of the most layered, most unexpectedly human stories in all of medieval history. Let me start with the numbers, because they are genuinely staggering. At the height of leprosy's prevalence in medieval Europe, roughly the 12th and 13th centuries, historians estimate that England alone had somewhere between 300 and 400 dedicated leper hospitals. For a country whose total population hovered around 2 to 3 million people, that represents an extraordinary institutional response to a single condition. France had even more. European-wide, the count at the peak of the epidemic likely exceeded 19,000 leprosaria across the continent. 19,000. To put that in perspective, there were more dedicated leper hospitals in medieval Europe than there were universities, cathedrals, or royal residences combined. This was not a marginal response to a marginal problem. This was a civilization mobilizing its institutional energy to deal with something it found both deeply frightening and simultaneously theologically significant. That theological significance is important, and I want to spend a moment on it before we go inside the walls, because it explains a tension that runs through the entire story of the medieval leper that has no clean modern equivalent. In medieval Christian thought, leprosy occupied a uniquely ambiguous position. On one hand, it was terrifying. The visible progressive transformation of the body, the skin lesions, the loss of sensation, The facial changes that could make a person nearly unrecognizable over years triggered a deep instinctive fear that medieval society made no real effort to suppress. Lepers were considered contagious, though medieval understanding of how disease spread was incorrect in its mechanisms. They were considered unclean in both the practical and the spiritual sense. They were under ecclesiastical and increasingly secular law, required to announce their presence when moving through public spaces by ringing a bell, clapping wooden clappers, or calling out a warning. The image is familiar: the hunched figure at the roadside, the bell, the warning cry, the people stepping away. We have all encountered it in some form. But here is the part that gets genuinely complicated. Simultaneously, leprosy in medieval Christian theology was understood as a form of purgation. Suffering purified the soul, and the leper, visibly undeniably suffering in a way that could not be concealed or managed, was in the eyes of many theologians and ordinary believers closer to God than the healthy person going about comfortable daily life. The leper was feared. The leper was also in a strange and sincere sense venerated. Pope Innocent III washed the feet of lepers in a public ceremony. St. Francis of Assisi famously embraced a leper on a road outside Assisi, an encounter he later described as the turning point of his spiritual life. King Louis IX of France, later canonized as a saint, personally cared for lepers on multiple occasions as acts of deliberate devotion. These were not peripheral figures. These were some of the most powerful and celebrated people in medieval Christendom, and their veneration of the leper shaped in direct and practical ways how leprosaria were funded, how they were built, and how the people inside them were treated. Now, the ceremony. What I'm about to describe is one of those historical details that the first time you encounter it makes you stop completely and just sit with it for a while. In some parts of medieval Europe, when a person was formally diagnosed with leprosy and admitted to a leprosarium, the admission was preceded by a religious ceremony that scholars have called, with varying degrees of interpretive caution, the separation rite. And in its most elaborate form, which varied significantly by region and period, so I want to be precise here, this ceremony bore a deliberate resemblance to a funeral. The afflicted person would be brought to the church. Psalms were sung. In some recorded versions, earth was symbolically scattered over the person's feet, echoing the burial rite, and words were pronounced that marked the beginning of a new legal and social status, one in which the person's former civil existence was in an official sense concluded. You are dead to the world, the ceremony declared, but alive in God. The practical implications were real and immediate. In the most stringent legal interpretations, a person who entered a leprosarium could no longer inherit property, could no longer hold office, could no longer contract a marriage. Their spouse in some jurisdictions was considered legally widowed. They had, in the eyes of secular society, ceased to exist. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not to horrify you, though it is genuinely horrifying by modern standards, but because the next part of this story only makes sense if you understand how complete that exclusion was supposed to be. Because then you walk through the gate of the leprosarium itself, and what you find inside is not as you might expect a place of despair. The leprosaria that have been excavated and documented by archaeologists, and there are now quite a number of them, particularly in England and France, reveal something that surprised the historians who first studied them carefully. These were not temporary holding facilities. They were not hastily built sheds on the edge of town. They were communities, designed in many cases with genuine care and considerable resources. A typical English leprosarium of the 12th or 13th century would include a chapel, always a chapel, because this was still fundamentally a religious institution. It would include dormitory or individual lodging space for the residents, a kitchen and hall for communal meals, latrine facilities, and this is the part I find particularly striking: gardens. Extensive gardens in many cases, with fruit trees, with fish ponds, with dedicated plots for growing vegetables and medicinal herbs. These were not the gardens of a facility designed to warehouse people until they ceased to be a problem. These were the gardens of a community that expected to be there for a long time and wanted, within the constraints of its situation, to live well. One of the most thoroughly studied leprosaria in England is St James and St Mary Magdalene at Chichester in West Sussex, founded sometime before the year 1118. Archaeological excavations there uncovered evidence of a complex that included not just the expected chapel and dormitory, but agricultural outbuildings, evidence of small-scale animal husbandry, and a substantial cemetery used over several centuries. The cemetery tells a particularly detailed story. Bioarchaeologists, scientists who study the biological information contained in human skeletal remains, have analysed the bones of individuals buried there and found something that directly challenges the image of the medieval leper as a starved, neglected outcast. The residents of this leprosarium ate well, and I mean that in a specific, documented, scientifically verified sense. Analysis of dental wear patterns in the skeletal remains at Chichester, combined with evidence from historical dietary records at other comparable institutions, indicates that the residents consumed meat at levels significantly higher than those typical for the general lower-class population of medieval England. Poultry, fresh fish, veal, pork, eggs, freshly baked white bread. Not because the medieval world was being generous in some vague, undirected way, but because medieval medical theory specifically prescribed these foods for people with leprosy. Remember the humoral framework we discussed in the last part. In that system, leprosy was understood as a condition caused by an excess of a particularly hot and dry humour-corrupted blood in the standard formulation. The prescribed dietary correction was food that was cooling and moistening mild meats, fresh fish, poultry foods considered easily digestible and soothing to what medieval physicians called the overheated digestive system. So the diet of the leper was within the medical logic of the time a treatment, and it was taken seriously enough that well-funded leprosaria actually provided it. The leper legally dead to the world, stripped of civil identity, required to ring a bell when moving through public spaces outside, was eating better than many of the free, healthy, socially intact people who watched from a distance. That irony is worth sitting with. The internal governance of these communities is fascinating and deserves more than a passing mention. Leprosaria were typically run by a master who might be a monk, a priest, or in later centuries increasingly a lay administrator. Below the master, the residents themselves often participated in the governance of daily life in ways that gave them genuine if limited agency. At many institutions, the residents elected their own officers for certain functions. They had formal mechanisms for raising complaints about the food or the conduct of staff. They had rights, actual documented rights to specific allocations of food, clothing, fuel, and in some cases small monetary allowances. The statutes of St Julian's Hospital in St Albans, preserved from the 13th century, specified in careful detail what each resident was owed: a daily allowance of bread, a weekly allowance of ale, regular portions of pottage and meat, a supply of firewood in winter, and an annual distribution of cloth sufficient to make clothing. These were not charity handouts at the discretion of a benefactor. They were contractual entitlements. If the master failed to provide them, the residents had at least in theory formal recourse. The medieval leper in a legal sense had no existence in the outside world. Inside the leprosarium they had rights. What about the rules that governed daily life? Because there were rules, considerable ones, and they shaped every waking hour. Most leprosaria operated on something close to a monastic schedule, which we touched on in the previous part. Prayers at the canonical hours. Communal meals taken in silence or with scripture read aloud. Restrictions on movement outside the community's boundaries. But the rules specific to leprosaria went further, and some of them reveal the particular anxieties that surrounded these places. Mixing between men and women was carefully regulated, not always successfully, as we can tell from occasional recorded complaints, but carefully in intention. Alcohol consumption was limited, though not eliminated. Ale was served as a dietary staple, but drunkenness was specifically prohibited and could result in punishment. Visitors from outside were permitted in most institutions, but under conditions. Family members could come, priests could come. Benefactors sometimes came to fulfill their devotional obligation of visiting the sick. But residents leaving, going into town, walking the roads, entering spaces where the healthy population moved freely required permission and was subject to strict protocols. The bell or clapper was to be carried and used. Distance was to be maintained from others at Wells Market's churches. In some institutions the rule went further. Residents were forbidden to touch the goods of others without permission, forbidden to share cups or utensils with visitors, forbidden to use public water sources shared with the general population. And yet, and this is the part that complicates the simple narrative of pure exclusion, they could still walk those roads. They could still visit churches. They could still, on certain days and with certain permissions, enter the town. The separation was real. It was also incomplete. Here is something I found in my research that I genuinely did not expect. The residents of well-run leprosaria were not as a rule people who had given up. The historical records where they survive show people who planted gardens and maintained fish ponds and argued about their bread rations and complained about the quality of the ale and requested specific items from family members on the outside. One document from a French leprosarium in the 13th century records a formal dispute brought by the residents against the master, alleging that he had been providing inferior fish during Lent, substituting cheaper, saltier preserved fish for the fresh fish they were contractually owed. They took him to arbitration, and they won. The residents of a medieval leprosarium declared legally dead by the society that housed them successfully sued their administrator over the quality of their Lenten fish. If that does not make them feel real to you, I am not sure what will. The decline of leprosy in Europe is a genuinely puzzling epidemiological story that historians and medical scientists still debate. From roughly the mid-14th century onward, the number of active leprosy cases in Western Europe began to fall slowly at first, then more rapidly. By the 15th century, many leprosaria across England were operating with only a handful of residents, or none at all. Former leper houses were being converted, as we'll discuss in more detail later in this series, into almshouses for the elderly poor. Several theories attempt to explain this decline. One of the most widely discussed involves the Black Death, the catastrophic outbreak of bubonic plague that struck Europe beginning in the year 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population within a few years. The argument goes like this: the plague may have selectively affected people with weakened immune systems and leprosy compromises immune function significantly. The plague may, in a brutal and accidental way, have killed a disproportionate number of people already carrying leprosy, effectively reducing the pool of potential transmission at a critical moment. There is also a competing theory involving tuberculosis. Some researchers believe that increasing exposure to tuberculosis, which shares an immune pathway with leprosy, may have conferred a degree of cross-immunity in European populations over time, gradually reducing the susceptibility of the general population. Neither theory is conclusively proven, but both remind us that the history of disease is always beneath the surface a story of populations and immune systems and evolutionary pressures playing out over generations in ways that no individual living through them could possibly have understood. The lepers of the 12th century had no idea they were living through an epidemic that would largely burn itself out within 200 years. They were simply living within the only world available to them. Before we move on from this world, I want to leave you with one more image. In the cemetery at Chichester, the same site where the dietary analysis revealed that residents ate surprisingly well, archaeologists found something in the arrangement of the graves that stopped them. The individuals buried with clear skeletal evidence of leprosy were not buried separately from those without it. They were not placed in a corner or in a lesser section, or in any way marked as different in death. They were interred together, mixed, without apparent distinction. Inside that community, once you were a resident, the distinction between the sick and the slightly less sick, the long-term and the newly arrived, appears to have mattered less than the simple fact of shared belonging. They were buried as neighbours, and I think that detail, quiet as it is, says something about what the leprosarium actually was beneath the fear, beneath the legal exclusion, beneath the bells and the clappers, and the ceremony of social death. It was a place where people who had been told they no longer existed managed somehow to build a life together anyway. That story of people making community in the face of exclusion is one we're going to keep encountering as we go deeper into this world. Because in just a moment we're moving inside a different kind of institution entirely. Not the house of the outcast, but the house of the elderly, the widowed, the simply worn out. The almshouse. And what you will find there, the bargain that was struck, the prayers that were owed, the rules that governed every hour of every day, and the remarkable story of the man who built one of the most famous of all these places as a last act of conscience, is a story about what it means to age in a world without pensions, without social security, without any of the safety nets we take so completely for granted that we have forgotten to be grateful for them. It is coming. Right now. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with being ill. It is the exhaustion of someone who has worked their entire life, perhaps 50 years as a weaver, or a cobbler, or a carpenter's assistant, whose hands have finally given out, whose back will no longer cooperate, whose children, if they had any, have their own struggles and their own hungry mouths, and genuinely cannot take one more person in. This person is not sick. They do not have leprosy or fever or any condition that a medieval physician would diagnose and treat. They are simply old and poor and out of options. In the 21st century, there are systems built for this person, imperfect systems, endlessly debated, chronically underfunded, but systems. There is some form of public provision waiting. In medieval England there was nothing, except in a growing number of towns and cities from the 11th century onward, a particular kind of building, with a chapel at its heart, a small courtyard often with a garden, individual rooms or a shared hall, a gate that would open under the right conditions to let you in, the almshouse. The word itself is worth pausing on because its origin tells you almost everything about the philosophy behind it. Alms comes from the Greek word meaning mercy, specifically mercy expressed through material giving. It passed through Latin into Old English, and eventually into the compound almshouse, a house built from the giving of mercy for those in need of receiving it. In Latin, these institutions were called the Domus Eleemosynariae, the house of almsgiving. In French, sometimes the Maison Dieu, though that term was applied more broadly. In common English usage, almshouse residents were often called bedsmen or bedderswomen, and that word is the key to understanding the entire bargain on which these places were built. Bede is the Old English word for prayer. A bedesman was literally a prayer man, a person whose primary obligation in exchange for the shelter and food and care they received was to pray. Specifically and by contract to pray for the soul of the person who had paid to build and maintain the institution that housed them, day after day, at the canonical hours, by name in some cases invoking the founder with the specific petition that God would be merciful to their soul in purgatory. This was not a vague expectation. It was in the most literal sense the terms of employment. The almshouse resident was paid in bread and ale and firewood and a roof to be a professional intercessor. a person whose prayers offered from a place of genuine poverty and need were believed to carry particular weight before God. The founder was not being generous, they were being strategic, and the beadsman was not receiving charity, they were fulfilling a contract. That reframing changes everything about how you understand these places, who built them, and why. The short answer is everyone who had enough money and enough anxiety about what came after death. Kings built almshouses. Henry VII, father of the more famous Henry VIII, founded a substantial almshouse attached to his magnificent chapel at Westminster. Edward IV endowed almshouses as part of his programme of public piety. Going back further, King Athelstan in the 10th century is credited in some records with founding the very first almshouse in York, though the details are hazy with age. Bishops and archbishops built them, often attached to cathedral precincts. The Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester, which we mentioned briefly in our opening part, was founded in the 1130s by Henry de Blois, the Bishop of Winchester, a man who was also, by the way, the brother of King Stephen and one of the most powerful figures in England at the time. When Henri de Blois founded an institution, he did not do it modestly. Wealthy merchants built them. This is in some ways the most interesting category, because these were people without the automatic spiritual credit that came with noble birth or ecclesiastical office. A merchant who had spent decades accumulating wealth through trade, through practices that the church eyed with varying degrees of suspicion, had particular reasons to want a small army of poor people praying for his soul. And trade guilds built them, which is a detail I find quietly fascinating because it represents a completely different model of care. Rather than one wealthy founder providing for anonymous poor strangers, a guild would establish an almshouse specifically for its own members who had fallen on hard times, a weavers' guild providing housing for elderly weavers, a merchant guild providing for the widows of deceased members. It was in essence an early form of occupational mutual insurance with a chapel attached, and prayer obligations baked into the contract. Let me tell you about a man named Richard Whittington. You may know the fairy tale version, Dick Whittington, and his cat, the boy from the country who comes to London, walks away. Discouraged, hears the bells of Bow Church seem to call him back, and eventually becomes Lord Mayor of the city. It is a charming story. It is also almost entirely fiction. The real Richard Whittington was considerably more interesting than the legend. He was a mercer, a merchant who traded in fine textiles, who served as Lord Mayor of London not once, not twice, but 4 times between the 1390s and 1420s. He was one of the wealthiest men in England, a significant moneylender to the crown and a figure of substantial political influence. And when he died in the year 1423 without surviving children, he left behind a will that directed his considerable fortune toward a series of charitable works that transformed parts of London for generations. Among them, a substantial rebuilding and endowment of the almshouse that bore his name, commonly known as Whittington's College, located near the church of St. Michael Paternoster in the city. The terms he laid out were specific. 13 poor men, that number again, always that number, would be housed, fed, clothed and cared for. They would be preferably former members of his own guild, the Mercers' Company, who had fallen into poverty through circumstances beyond their control, and they would be required every day to gather around Whittington's tomb in the church and recite the De Profundis, one of the great penitential psalms, a prayer for those in purgatory, calling specifically on God to have mercy on Richard Whittington's soul. 13 old men gathering at the tomb of the richest mercer in London, praying for his soul by contractual obligation every single day for as long as the institution existed. Henry VIII dissolved the religious components of the foundation in the 1540s, but Whittington's charitable endowment as a civil charity survived. It survived the Reformation. It survived the Great Fire of London. It survived the centuries. Almshouses under the Whittington name still exist today, now located in East Grinstead in Sussex. The prayers presumably stopped at some point, but the houses remain. Now let me take you inside one of these places. Not as a tourist, but as a new resident. You are, let us say, a woman of about 60, a widow. Your husband was a member of a respectable guild, perhaps a draper or a cordwainer. He died 3 years ago, and with him went the income, the trade, contacts, the social position that his membership provided. Your children have their own difficulties. The small savings you had are exhausted, and a place has opened up in the local guild's almshouse. You have been admitted. The ceremony is behind you. You have been shown to your room. In the better-funded institutions, and the quality varied enormously, from genuinely comfortable to barely adequate. You would have a room of your own. Not a bed in a shared ward, as in the hospital proper, but an individual chamber. Small, certainly. Probably a single window facing a courtyard or a garden. A fireplace, or at least access to a communal fire. A bed. A small chest for your belongings. This was in material terms a significant upgrade for many people entering from genuine poverty. Your own room, your own fire. 3 meals a day you did not have to earn or prepare. But the rules. Let us talk about the rules. Almshouse statutes from across England and the continent, and a substantial number of them survive in archives, reveal a daily life of almost monastic regularity. Morning prayers were obligatory. You rose when the bell rang, which in most institutions was before dawn. You attended the chapel service. You returned for breakfast. You attended the midday office. You had your main meal of the day. You attended the afternoon prayers. You had your supper. You attended the evening service. The gates of the institution closed at a specific hour, and you were expected to be inside them. Absence from chapel services was noticed, recorded in some cases, and could result in the loss of your daily allowance for that day. Repeated absence could result in expulsion. You were forbidden in most institutions from keeping animals, with occasional exceptions for small domestic cats permitted as mousers. You were forbidden from taking in lodgers or sub-tenants. You were forbidden from conducting trade or business from your room. You were expected to maintain your portion of any communal spaces in good order. You were in the language of one set of statutes from a 14th century English almshouse to live peaceably and charitably with your fellow residents, avoiding quarrelling, loud speech, and all manner of discord that might disturb the tranquillity of this house. Which tells you with wonderful clarity that quarrelling, loud speech, and various forms of discord were frequent enough to require explicit prohibition. People were people even in God's house. What were you actually given in material terms? The specifics varied by institution and by century, but the historical record gives us enough detail to build a reasonably clear picture. Bread was the foundation of everything. Most almshouses provided a daily bread allowance, typically a loaf of white or mixed wheat bread per person per day. The quality was specified in the statutes and taken seriously enough that departures from it generated formal complaints. Ale was included at nearly every institution because, as we discussed in the previous part, ale was a nutritional staple rather than an indulgence. The daily ale allowance at many English almshouses in the 13th and 14th centuries was somewhere between a pint and 2 pints, modest but consistent. Beyond bread and ale, most well-funded almshouses provided a weekly or twice-weekly allowance of pottage with meat portions on certain days of the week, and fish on the mandated fast days. Special allocations on feast days, Christmas, Easter. The feast of the institution's patron saint might include extras, better cuts of meat, small quantities of wine, occasionally a distribution of coins for personal use. Clothing was provided annually in most institutions, a fixed allocation of cloth sufficient to make a gown or a cloak, sometimes shoes, sometimes a specific garment, a hood, a cap, a robe that marked the wearer as belonging to a particular institution. This served both a practical function and a symbolic one. It made residents identifiable as belonging to a specific community, which mattered for both the institution's reputation and the residents' social identity. Firewood, or in some institutions, charcoal, was allocated by season. Winter allocations were specified, summer allocations reduced. Heat was in a stone building in northern England a genuine matter of survival rather than comfort. Here is something I've been thinking about for a while, and I want to share it with you because I think it matters. We tend to look at the almshouse system through one of two lenses. Either we see it as a form of medieval social welfare, imperfect, paternalistic, but genuinely caring for vulnerable people, or we see it as a transaction dressed up as charity wealthy people purchasing spiritual insurance while treating the poor as instruments of their salvation. Both of those readings are accurate, and I think the discomfort of holding them simultaneously is precisely what makes this history so valuable, because every system of care ever built by human beings has contained both impulses simultaneously: the genuine desire to help and the self-interested motives that fund that desire and shape its implementation, the authentic compassion of the people doing the day-to-day work and the complicated motivations of the people paying for it. What the medieval almshouse did at its best was create a structure within which both impulses could produce real outcomes for real people. The wealthy founder got their prayers, the elderly widow got her room, and her bread and her fire and her community of neighbours. Both parties got something they needed. The transaction was unequal in power, profoundly obviously so. But it was not nothing, and for the person who would otherwise have been facing a winter alone in genuine destitution, it was quite simply the difference between living and not. Let me give you one more detail before we move forward, one that I think captures the texture of almshouse life in a way that statistics and statutes never quite manage. Many almshouses, particularly those established by trade guilds, maintained a specific tradition on the anniversary of the founder's death. The residents would gather in the chapel, a special mass was said, and afterward, this is the part I love, they would have a feast. Not the usual daily bread and pottage, a proper feast with better food and sometimes music and a distribution of small gifts, candles perhaps, a coin, a piece of cloth, something that was not merely functional, something that acknowledged the residents as people who deserved occasionally a moment of celebration rather than just maintenance. The feast was in honour of the founder, yes. It was part of the memorial system, the ongoing economic exchange of prayer for sustenance. But it was also just a feast, with food and warmth and the company of people you lived alongside, people who knew your name and your history and your particular manner of complaining about the quality of the firewood this year. It was by any measure a good evening, and in a world without pensions, without any form of state provision for the elderly and the vulnerable, without anything we would recognize as a safety net, a guaranteed good evening recurring every year for the rest of your life was not something you took lightly. We have now spent time in the leprosarium and the almshouse, the two institutions that sat at the edges of medieval healthcare, serving those who could not be cured and those who needed simply to be housed and sustained. But there is a third world we've not yet fully entered, the people who ran these places, not the founders, not the residents, but the ones in between, the men and women who showed up every day, who changed the bedding and prepared the meals and sat with the dying and kept the accounts and argued with the bishops about funding and tried in the specific and grinding way of all institutional work to make the whole complicated thing actually function. Who were they? What was their daily life? What did it cost them in ways that the historical record sometimes captures but more often misses entirely? That story is waiting, and it is closer than you think. Most institutions leave behind their architecture, their founding documents, their lists of rules and regulations. What they rarely leave behind is the sound of the people who actually kept them running. The master who stayed up past Compline checking the grain stores before the first frost. The lay sister who had been changing bedding every morning for 30 years and had by that point opinions about the quality of the linen that she was not shy about expressing. The porter who sat at the gate in all weather deciding with no formal training and considerable personal judgment who looked sick enough to let in and who looked like trouble. These are the people we're going to spend time with now, and I want to be honest with you about something before we start. They are harder to find in the historical record than the founders and the patients. The wealthy man who endowed a hospital got his name on the building. The monk who ran it for 40 years, mostly competently, occasionally not left behind almost nothing, except the faint outline in account books and the occasional disciplinary record. But those faint outlines are there, and when you learn to read them, they tell a story that's more complicated, more human, and considerably more entertaining than the idealized version of medieval hospital care that sometimes gets presented as history. Let us start at the top with the master. In most English and French hospitals of the 12th through 15th centuries, the master, sometimes called the warden, sometimes the prior, sometimes simply the keeper, was the person on whom the entire functioning of the institution depended. They managed the finances, supervised the staff, maintained the physical fabric of the buildings, dealt with benefactors and complaints, and the occasional episcopal visitation, and were personally responsible for ensuring that the spiritual life of the institution ran according to schedule. It was by any measure an enormous job, and the qualifications required for it were, shall we say, unevenly distributed among the people who actually held it. Here is why this matters. The master of a hospital was almost always an appointee nominated by whoever had patronage rights over the institution. A bishop's hospital meant a bishop's appointee. A royal foundation meant a royal nominee. A guild hospital meant a guild council's choice. And patronage in medieval England was very rarely purely about competence. The records of episcopal visitations, formal inspections of hospitals and other religious institutions, carried out periodically by the overseeing bishop, are among the most candid documents the Middle Ages produced precisely because they were intended as internal audits rather than public relations. And what they reveal again and again across the 13th and 14th centuries is a persistent gap between what hospital masters were supposed to be doing and what they were actually doing. Take the case of the Hospital of St. Leonard in York, which was by the 14th century one of the largest and most significant charitable hospitals in the north of England. Its records are unusually complete, which makes it unusually illuminating. Visitation records from the 1300s reveal a catalogue of problems at St. Leonard's that will feel, I suspect, immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever worked in or around a large institution. Financial mismanagement. The master at one point under investigation had been drawing personal income from hospital revenues in ways that were not sanctioned by the founding statutes. The grain stores had been depleted beyond what the season warranted. The accounts had not been properly audited in years. Staff problems. Several of the brothers responsible for patient care were recorded as spending time outside the hospital, without permission, neglecting their assigned duties, and in at least one case maintaining arrangements with women from the town that violated their vows. Physical deterioration. Parts of the building had fallen into disrepair that would not have been permitted under a more attentive master. Leaking roofs, deteriorating stonework, a general atmosphere of institutional drift, and the detail that I find both darkest and most human, the number of patients actually being cared for had quietly declined from what the statutes required. The hospital was in effect providing less care than it was legally obligated to provide, while continuing to collect its endowment income. The bishop who conducted this visitation was not gentle in his language. His report used terms like negligence, scandal, and at one point a Latin phrase that translates roughly as a disgrace to the church. St. Leonard's was reformed, temporarily, and then over the following decades many of the same problems gradually crept back. This is the pattern that repeats across the visitation records reform drift, because institutions are made of people, and people, even well-intentioned ones, drift. I want to be fair to the masters who were genuinely trying to do their jobs well, because there were many of them, and their challenges were real. Running a medieval hospital was financially precarious in ways that would have kept anyone up at night. The primary income source for most hospitals was their endowment land and property that generated rental income, which was then used to fund operations. In theory, a well-endowed hospital with productive lands should have been able to sustain itself indefinitely. In practice, the 14th century threw a series of catastrophes at these endowments that no founder had anticipated. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed perhaps 10 to 15% of the population of Northern Europe. Rents collapsed. Agricultural production fell. Tenants who could not pay their rents were not worth evicting because there was no one to replace them. Hospital income fell sharply, while the number of sick and destitute people needing care rose just as sharply. Then came the Black Death beginning in 1347, which we will examine in its own detail later in this series. But for now, a hospital master watching the plague approach their institution would have faced a situation with no good options and no precedent to guide them. Some masters closed the gates and tried to protect their staff and their functioning institution from the flood of desperate dying people attempting to enter. Others opened the gates as wide as they would go and watched their staff die alongside the patients. Neither choice was obviously wrong given what they knew, and both produced terrible outcomes. The miracle honestly is that any of these institutions survived the 14th century at all, and the fact that many of them did is a testament to the resilience and the sheer stubbornness of the people who ran them. Now, let us talk about the women, because the story of medieval hospital care cannot be told honestly without spending significant time on the religious women who formed in many institutions the core of the nursing staff and whose contribution to the history of healthcare has been so consistently undervalued that correcting the record feels genuinely urgent. In hospitals run by religious orders, which included most of the major urban hospitals of medieval England, France and Italy, the practical care of patients was divided between the brothers and the sisters of the community. The brothers typically handled the administrative and liturgical functions, managing finances, conducting religious services, dealing with external affairs. The sisters did the majority of what we would now call nursing care. They changed the dressings. They prepared the food and served it. They cleaned the wards. They bathed patients. They sat with people in the hours before death. They managed the linen supply, and in a large hospital, the laundry alone represented a substantial daily workload in an era when everything had to be washed by hand in cold water by people with no rubber gloves or waterproof aprons. And they did this work without any of the professional recognition or formal training structures that we now associate with nursing. There was no certificate to earn, no curriculum to complete, no title that distinguished an experienced hospital sister from a new recruit. What they had instead was accumulated practical knowledge passed down through practice, guided by the more experienced women in the community, refined over years of daily work with sick and dying people. Some of this knowledge was genuinely advanced by the standards of the time. Hospital sisters who had spent decades in their work would have developed an intuitive understanding of wound care, of the signs of fever breaking, of the difference between a patient who was improving and one who was declining in ways that the official medical theory could not fully account for. They knew things that were not written in any book because the books were not being written by them. This is one of the great silences in the history of medieval medicine. The practical knowledge accumulated by women in caregiving roles over centuries of direct experience largely did not make it into the written record, because the written record was maintained almost exclusively by men in Latin. What the sisters knew they taught each other in vernacular speech in the daily practice of the ward, and when those communities were disrupted by the Reformation, by institutional closure, by the dissolution of religious houses, much of that accumulated practical wisdom simply disappeared. The lay staff deserve a moment too, because by the later Middle Ages most larger hospitals operated with a substantial component of non-religious workers, alongside the professed brothers and sisters, cooks, washerwomen, porters, gardeners. In the larger institutions, a barber surgeon who visited on a contract basis to perform bleedings, lance abscesses, dress wounds, and carry out the more physically demanding medical interventions that the infirmarius might supervise but not perform. The barber surgeon is a figure who tends to get a somewhat unfair reputation in popular history, reduced to a kind of medieval butcher figure doing damage in the name of medicine. And it is true that some of the procedures they performed were by modern understanding harmful. Therapeutic bloodletting as a universal treatment for fever is not something modern medicine endorses, but the barber surgeon also set broken bones, and did so with genuine skill using splinting techniques that we can verify from skeletal remains show evidence of proper healing. They sutured wounds. They managed infections with herbal preparations that in some cases contained compounds we now know to have genuine antimicrobial properties. They developed through practice and observation a body of technique that represented the practical edge of medieval medical knowledge. A good barber surgeon contracted to a well-run hospital was a real asset. A bad one, which the records also document, could do considerable harm. There are visitation reports from hospitals noting specific complaints about surgical interventions that went wrong, about fees charged for services not rendered, about practitioners who came when convenient rather than when needed. As in every century, the quality of care depended enormously on the quality of the people providing it. Here is something I have been sitting with while researching this part of the story, and I want to share it because I think it is worth your consideration. We talk about medieval healthcare in a way that almost inevitably positions it as a predecessor, an early inadequate version of something that eventually became what we have now. The infirmarius was a precursor to the doctor, the hospital sister was a precursor to the nurse, the barber surgeon was a precursor to the surgeon, all roads leading forward to the gleaming rational science-based institution of the modern hospital. But I'm not sure that framing does full justice to what these people actually were. The infirmarius, who had spent 30 years in a hospital ward, had a relationship with illness and dying that no amount of formal medical education can fully replicate. The hospital sister, who sat with a patient through a night of high fever, monitoring the subtle changes in breathing and skin colour that indicated whether the crisis was passing or deepening, was exercising a form of clinical judgment that was real and practiced and important, regardless of whether it was recognized as such by the official structures of the church or the university. These were not proto-doctors and proto-nurses waiting for science to arrive and validate their existence. They were professionals in their own right, operating within the best available framework of knowledge and practice, doing genuinely difficult work with competence that deserves recognition on its own terms. The fact that the framework was wrong in important ways does not diminish the competence exercised within it. I believe that, and I think the historical record read honestly supports it. One more figure before we close this part of the story, one who tends to fall completely out of the picture despite being in practical terms one of the most important people in any hospital's daily life. The porter, the person who sat at the gate, who decided in the first instance who got through and who did not, who was often the first face a sick or desperate person saw when they arrived seeking help, who dealt with the people turned away, which, as we discussed in an earlier part, was a significant number. We have almost no individual records of medieval hospital porters. They appear in account books as a line item, a small wage, a daily food allowance. They appear in statutes as a function to be filled. They appear in occasional complaint records when they let in someone they should not have, or refused entry to someone who turned out to have been eligible. But the human reality of that job sitting at a gate in all weathers, exercising constant judgment calls about human need and institutional capacity being the point at which the ideals of the house of God met the actual complicated, often dirty and desperate reality of the people seeking refuge within it, that reality is almost entirely invisible in the record. I think about those porters sometimes, about what it would have cost them to say no, about how they decided on a winter evening with a queue of people at the gate and a ward already at capacity who got through and who did not. We do not know their names, but they were there every day doing one of the hardest jobs in the institution, and that seems worth acknowledging even 900 years later. We have been looking in this part of our journey at the people who kept these places running from the inside, the masters and the sisters and the barber surgeons and the porters, but there is an outside force we've not yet fully reckoned with, one that arrived without warning, that overwhelmed every system these institutions had built, that killed their staff and their patients indiscriminately, and forced medieval society to confront questions about care and contagion and collective response that it had never had to answer before. It arrived in English ports in the summer of 1348, and nothing, not the hospitals, not the almshouses, not the leprosaria, not the carefully maintained endowments and statutes and centuries of accumulated institutional practice, was prepared for it. What happened next is the most dramatic chapter in this entire story, and it begins right now. Summer of 1348. The ships had already come and gone from Weymouth on the Dorset coast. The sailors aboard them had brought something invisible with them, something that moved faster than any messenger that crossed the stone walls of manor houses and the timber walls of peasant cottages with equal indifference, that did not distinguish between the body of a bishop and the body of a beggar. By August it had reached Bristol. By autumn it was in London. By the following year it had pushed north into Scotland and west into Wales, and east across the Channel into France, where it was already tearing through communities that had been watching the news from England with mounting dread. We have touched on the Black Death before in this series briefly, in the context of how it affected the leper houses and the endowments that funded medieval healthcare, but I have been saving the full weight of this story for now because it deserves to be told in full. Because what happened to the hospitals of medieval Europe during the plague years is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of institutional care. And it begins not with death, but with a question. What do you do when the thing you were built to contain becomes larger than you? That was the question facing every hospital master, every infirmarius, every sister and brother in every charitable institution in England and France, in the autumn and winter of 1348. And the honest answer, the one that the historical record forces us to confront, is that most of them did not know, because nobody knew, because nothing in human experience, at least within living memory, had prepared them for this. Let me give you some numbers, and I want you to really hear them, rather than letting them slide past as abstract statistics. Before the Black Death reached England, the country had a population of somewhere between 4 and 6 million people. When the worst of the initial outbreak had passed by around 1350, that number had fallen to somewhere between 2 and 3 million, possibly lower. Between a third and a half of the entire population of England was gone within 2 to 3 years. In some communities the mortality was even higher. The monastery of Mow in Yorkshire lost 42 of its 50 monks. The village of Eam in Derbyshire, though its famous story belongs to a later outbreak, gives us a template for what total community devastation looked like. Some villages in England simply ceased to exist. The grass grew over the field strips. The cottages collapsed. The names survived only in records attached to land that nobody was farming anymore. Now, into this catastrophe consider the position of a hospital. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris is, as I mentioned in our third part, one of the best documented hospitals of the medieval world. It had been operating continuously since the 7th century. By the mid-14th century it was a large complex institution with a substantial community of Augustinian sisters providing the core nursing care. What happened to those sisters during the Black Death is documented in ways that still carry their full emotional weight after nearly 7 centuries. Contemporary accounts describe the sisters continuing to care for the flood of patients arriving at the Hôtel Dieu throughout the worst months of the outbreak. The institution, which had beds for somewhere around 300 patients under normal circumstances, found itself attempting to care for numbers far beyond its capacity. People were brought in, or arrived on their own in the advanced stages of the illness, the characteristic swellings in the armpit and groin, the fever, the darkening of the skin at the extremities that gave the outbreak one of its most enduring names. The sisters did not close the doors, and they paid an enormous price for that decision. Accounts from the period recorded by contemporaries who were trying to make sense of an experience that defied comprehension describe the sisters dying in waves. A group would fall ill. The survivors would continue working while their colleagues were dying in beds alongside the patients. New sisters were brought in from outside to replace the dead. They too fell ill. One contemporary source states that in a single year of the outbreak, the Augustinian sisters at the Hôtel Dieu lost the majority of their number to the disease they were trying to treat. The exact figures are disputed by historians. Medieval record-keeping in crisis conditions was understandably imprecise, but the broad picture is clear and consistent across multiple accounts. These women stayed, they worked, they died at their posts, and then others came and took their places. I find it difficult to write about this without stopping. The English hospital system faced its own particular crisis during the plague years, and the records that survive from episcopal visitations and administrative correspondence give us glimpses of institutions struggling to maintain any semblance of normal function. Henry Knighton, an Augustinian canon writing his chronicle at Leicester, in the years after the first outbreak recorded his observations with a directness that makes the pages feel almost immediate across the centuries. He described entire communities of religious men and women, the very people who staffed the hospitals and almshouses, being reduced to single figures. Priories where 20 brothers had lived reduced to 2 or 3. Convents where 30 sisters had served reduced to 4 or 5, trying to maintain the liturgical life, and the charitable work of institutions built for 10 times their number. The practical implications for hospital care were severe. A hospital that normally operated with, say, 8 brothers and sisters attending to patients suddenly found itself with 2. The rounds still needed to be made, the food still needed to be prepared and served. The beds still needed to be changed, and during the plague, the turnover of beds was occurring at a pace that no laundry system was designed to handle. The chapel services, those canonical hours that structured every single day, still needed to be observed, because prayer was within this worldview not a luxury to be dispensed with in crisis, but the most essential function of all. And all of this had to be done by people who were themselves frightened, who had watched their colleagues die, who knew with the particular clarity that comes from direct observation that the work they were doing was killing them. What did the medicine of the time make of the plague? I want to spend a moment here, because the medical response is genuinely illuminating about both the limitations and the intellectual seriousness of medieval thought. In the autumn of 1348, King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris to investigate the cause of the epidemic and issue a formal report. This document, known as the Compendium de Epidemia, survives, and it is a remarkable thing to read. The physicians and masters who wrote it were working within the humoral framework we've discussed. Their conclusion, reached after careful deliberation, was that the plague had been caused by a conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in March of 1345, an astronomical event that had in their analysis corrupted the air over large portions of the Earth, introducing a miasma that when breathed disturbed the humoral balance of the body fatally. This is wrong. We know it is wrong. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried by rats, with some component of respiratory transmission in its most virulent mnemonic form. But here is what I want you to notice about the Paris faculty's response. It was systematic. It was based on the best available evidence and analytical framework. It sought causes, not scapegoats, at least in its initial official form, and it generated practical recommendations that, while not effective against the actual mechanism of transmission, were not entirely without value. Fresh air, avoidance of corrupted environments, moderation in eating and drinking. These are not unreasonable responses to an airborne illness, even if the plague was not primarily airborne. The physicians of medieval Europe were not stupid. They were working with incorrect foundational assumptions, which made it impossible for them to arrive at the correct answer, regardless of how carefully they reasoned. That is a different problem than stupidity, and it is one that should inspire a certain humility in all of us about the assumptions embedded in our own most confident beliefs. Pope Clement VI, who ruled the Church from Avignon during the plague years, presents one of the most interesting individual case studies of the entire outbreak. Avignon, as the seat of the papacy, was a substantial city densely populated, intensely connected by trade and pilgrimage to the wider European world. When the plague arrived there in early 1348, it hit hard and fast. Clement's personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, one of the most distinguished medical writers of the 14th century, attended the Pope throughout the outbreak and left us a remarkably candid personal account of what that experience was like. Guy de Chauliac himself contracted the plague and survived, which was itself unusual enough that he documented his own illness and recovery in clinical detail. Clement, on the advice of his physicians, sat for extended periods between two large fires, a response based on the miasma theory, which held that heat and purified air would counteract the corrupt atmosphere. Whether this actually protected him, or whether he simply had the good fortune of natural immunity, or whether his relative isolation from the crowds of Avignon reduced his exposure, we cannot know. He survived, and in surviving he used his position to issue two significant papal bulls that have bearing on our story. One directed that those who died of plague could be buried in unconsecrated ground, which had been required in canon law, and which was becoming, with the cemeteries of every institution overflowing, physically impossible to observe. The other condemned the widespread practice of attacking Jewish communities on the accusation that they had caused the plague by poisoning the wells, a piece of lethal scapegoating that Clement declared explicitly false and sinful, and which was being used to justify violence across much of Europe, even as the dead were being buried in mass pits. These were not nothing. In the middle of the worst catastrophe his world had ever experienced, the Pope used his authority to try to manage the practical crisis of burial, and to defend an innocent minority from murderous collective panic. It was not enough. The violence continued. The cemeteries still overflowed. But it's worth noting in the balance sheet of history that the voice of the institution spoke in the right direction. What did the plague do to the hospitals themselves, not just in the immediate crisis, but in the years that followed? This is the part of the story that I find most historically significant, because it is where catastrophe becomes transformation. The first and most obvious effect was devastating institutional disruption. Communities that had functioned continuously for a century or more lost their experienced members faster than they could be replaced. The accumulated practical knowledge of generations how to manage a ward, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to handle the particular challenges of a building that had quirks known only to the people who had worked within it for decades, was simply gone, carried away with the people who held it. Rebuilding took a generation, in some cases longer, but alongside the destruction came something unexpected, a shift in thinking about what hospitals were for. Before the plague, the dominant model of the hospital was, as we have discussed at length, the model of spiritual care and long-term residence. The goal was not cure, it was companionship in suffering prayer, maintenance of the soul, alongside the body. After the plague, partly because the plague had demonstrated so brutally the limitations of that model, and partly because the post-plague world was a changed place, with changed demographics and changed social structures, a gradual shift began to occur. The emphasis moved slowly and unevenly towards something closer to what we would recognize as curative medicine. Hospitals began in some cities to employ trained physicians on a more formal basis. The idea that a hospital should function as a place where people came to get better, not just to be housed in their suffering, began to gain traction. This shift was not sudden, and it was not universal. It took centuries to complete. But its roots are here in the wreckage of the plague years, in the desperate attempts of survivors to rebuild institutions that could do more than the old ones had managed to do. And then there is the quarantine. This is perhaps the most consequential practical innovation that emerged from the plague experience, and it came not from the hospitals, but from the city-states of northern Italy, the places most densely connected by trade to the routes along which the plague travelled. Venice was at the forefront. As early as 1377, the port city of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast, then under Venetian influence, established a formal policy requiring arriving ships and travellers from plague-affected areas to wait for 30 days before entering the city. The purpose was explicit to determine whether those arriving were carrying the illness. 30 days proved insufficient, and by the time Venice formalized its own system in the following decades, the waiting period had been extended to 40 days. 40 days? In Italian quarantina giorni, shortened in the language that passed into English and every other European tongue quarantine, the word we still use. The concept that shaped every pandemic response for the next 600 years, including some very recent ones that I suspect several people listening to this are thinking about right now. The medieval world invented it. Not from a correct understanding of how disease transmitted, they still believed in miasma, in corrupted air, in humoral imbalance, but from observation, from watching what happened when ships arrived from infected ports and their crews moved freely into the city, from the terrible empirical lesson that distance and time between the sick and the healthy reduced the spread. They didn't know why it worked, they only knew that it did. And so they built the system around it. I want to close this part with something that has stayed with me through all the research I've done for this series. In the chronicles written in the years immediately after the first outbreak of plague, there is a recurring note that strikes me as important. Writers who survived monks, notaries, priests, secular administrators often commented on a particular quality of the years after the plague. A silence where there had been noise, empty houses, missing faces in familiar places, but alongside that grief in some of the accounts there is also something else. A particular attentiveness to the people who had stayed, who had not fled, who had continued their work in the hospitals and the almshouses and the streets of the cities when every rational calculation of personal survival said they should leave. Henry Knighton, writing about what he had witnessed, specifically named the sisters who remained at their posts as deserving of remembrance, not in grand language, in the quiet, specific language of a man who'd seen something and wanted to make sure it was written down. That impulse to name the people who stayed to make sure the record held their presence feels to me like one of the most deeply human impulses in the whole of this story. We're going to talk in just a moment about what happened after the plague, about how the survivors rebuilt, about the economics of the medieval healthcare system, who paid for all of it, where the money came from, what happened when it ran out, and the extraordinary story of a man who turned his own final act of conscience into a foundation that changed the face of charity in England. The story of the money, it turns out, is just as dramatic as the story of the illness. Stay with me. Money has always been the unglamorous foundation beneath every beautiful idea. You can have the most sincere vision of a house of mercy, a place where the suffering are received, where the dying are not alone, where the elderly widow has bread and fire and a community of neighbours. You can mean every word of it with your whole heart. And then the harvest fails 2 years in a row, and the rent from your hospital's farmland comes in at half what was expected, and the roof needs repairs you cannot afford, and the brothers are complaining that the ale allowance has been reduced again. And suddenly the beautiful idea is just a building with a leaking ceiling and a lot of people inside it who need feeding. This is the part of medieval hospital history that the founding charters do not show you. The part that lives in the account books and the letters and the desperate petitions to bishops and kings, asking for relief from tax burdens or confirmation of disputed land rights, or just please some acknowledgement that this institution exists and deserves to survive. It is less romantic than the ideals, but it is in every practical sense what determined whether those ideals had any effect on the actual world. Let me start with something that often gets overlooked when people discuss the economics of medieval charity, the role of indulgences. We tend to think of indulgences, the formal remission of time in purgatory, granted by papal or episcopal authority, primarily in the context of the Reformation, when Martin Luther's furious objections to their abuse helped fracture the Western Church. But long before that crisis, indulgences were one of the primary financial instruments of medieval charitable institutions. Here is how it worked in practical terms. A bishop, or in cases involving major institutions, the Pope himself, would issue a formal document granting an indulgence to anyone who visited a particular hospital on certain feast days, or who made a donation of a specified minimum amount to its maintenance. The indulgence might remit 40 days from the donor's expected time in purgatory, or 100 days, or in exceptional cases several years. This was not a transaction in the way a modern financial instrument is a transaction. It was a spiritual incentive embedded in a material gift. The donor gave money, the institution received funds it needed, and the donor received in exchange a formal ecclesiastical promise that their suffering after death would be measurably reduced. Hospitals actively solicited these indulgences from their overseeing bishops, because the practical effect was immediate and substantial. An indulgence attached to a major feast day could generate a significant influx of donations and pilgrim visitors in a single afternoon that might represent a meaningful fraction of the institution's annual operating budget. St. Bartholomew's in London, the institution founded by Rahere, the former court jester we met in an earlier part, benefited from exactly this kind of episcopal generosity. Its early records show a succession of indulgence grants attached to the feast of St. Bartholomew himself, which fell in late August and drew crowds to Smithfield for both the fair and the religious observances. The hospital's proximity to this annual gathering was not accidental. It was strategic positioning in the most literal sense. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated and where I want to ask you something directly. Do you think it matters why someone gives? Not in a philosophical sense, I know there are long and interesting arguments there, but in a practical one. If a wealthy London merchant donates £50 to a hospital in the year 1380, because he has just been told by his confessor that his trading practices have put his soul at significant risk, and he needs to perform visible works of mercy rather urgently does the patient who receives care because of that donation care about his motivation? I have been thinking about this question throughout this entire project, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. The motivation was almost always mixed. The care was almost always real. The economics of salvation, for all its transactional architecture, produced genuine outcomes for genuinely suffering people. And I think that matters even when the theology that generated it is not one we share. Now let me take you to Florence, because the Italian story is sufficiently different from the English one that it opens up a whole new dimension of what medieval hospital economics could look like. In the cities of northern and central Italy, Florence, Siena, Bologna, Venice, a different model of charitable organization emerged alongside the monastic hospital. These were the confraternities, lay associations of citizens typically organized around a shared devotional practice or a specific act of mercy, who pooled their resources and their labor to fund and operate charitable institutions. The confraternity model was important for a reason that the monastic model had struggled to achieve. It made ordinary citizens not just the wealthy elite active participants in the economics of care. A confraternity might have 100 members, each paying a modest annual subscription. Together, those subscriptions funded a budget sufficient to maintain a small hospital or almshouse. The members took turns providing direct care, cooking, cleaning, sitting with patients as part of their devotional practice. The institution was not dependent on a single wealthy patron whose heirs might dispute the endowment or whose spiritual enthusiasm might not survive into the next generation. It was in structure something remarkably close to what we would now recognize as a mutual aid society. Or pushing the analogy a little further, something like a cooperative. The most celebrated product of this model in the English-speaking world is probably the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, the Hospital of the Innocents, founded in 1419 by the Silk Merchants Guild and designed by Filippo Brunelleschi in what became one of the defining works of early Renaissance architecture. It was primarily a foundling hospital, an institution for abandoned infants, but it exemplifies the confraternity and guild model of hospital finance at its most developed, craft-based civic, architecturally serious, funded by collective commitment rather than individual patronage. And then there is Santa Maria Nuova. Santa Maria Nuova in Florence deserves a moment of particular attention because it represents something genuinely remarkable in the history of hospital finance. It was founded in 1288 by a man named Folco Portinari, whose daughter Beatrice you may recognize as the woman that Dante Alighieri loved and idealized and made immortal in the Divine Comedy. Folco was a wealthy banker, and his foundation of Santa Maria Nuova was a conventional act of pious generosity by a successful man preparing for death. But what Santa Maria Nuova became over the following century and a half is anything but conventional. Through a combination of careful endowment management, strategic acquisition of property, sophisticated investment of its capital, and genuinely prudent administration, Santa Maria Nuova grew from a small institution into the most financially sophisticated hospital in medieval Europe. By the early 15th century, it was not only self-sustaining, but was actively generating surplus income that it reinvested into further property acquisition and the expansion of its services. It had in effect become a medieval healthcare corporation. With diversified income streams, professional financial management, and a governance structure sophisticated enough that the great banking families of Florence the Medici among them maintained accounts there and consulted with its administrators on matters of investment. Lorenzo de' Medici in the late 15th century described Santa Maria Nuova as one of the finest institutions in Italy. He was not wrong, and the model, it represented the hospital as a financially sophisticated, actively managed institution, rather than a passive recipient of charitable largesse, was genuinely ahead of its time. Henry VII of England visited Florence in his youth. Historians have suggested with reasonable evidence that what he saw there influenced his own major hospital foundation, the Savoy Hospital in London, established in 1505. The Savoy is worth pausing on because it was one of the most ambitious hospital projects in English history, and its story has an ending that tells you a great deal about the fragility of even the best-funded medieval institutions. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, the man who ended the Wars of the Roses, the careful, methodical, sometimes miserly monarch who spent his reign restoring royal finances after decades of civil conflict, chose as one of his major acts of pious generosity to build a hospital on the site of the old Savoy Palace on the north bank of the Thames. The Savoy Palace had been burned to the ground during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and the site had sat largely derelict for over a century. Henry acquired it and directed that a hospital be constructed there capable of housing 100 beds for poor men, not almshouse residents, not long-term elderly, but genuinely sick people who would be admitted, treated and discharged when they recovered. 100 beds, for genuinely curative medicine insofar as the early 16th century understood that concept. He endowed it richly. His will directed that a substantial portion of his personal fortune, accumulated over decades of careful royal finance, be directed to its maintenance. The endowment was designed to generate sufficient annual income to fund the institution in perpetuity. And then, Henry VII died in 1509. His son Henry VIII was 18 years old, more interested in jousting and theology than in the careful management of charitable endowments. The Savoy Hospital struggled almost from its first decade. The endowment income was disputed. The administration was contested. By the time Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries began in the 1530s, the Savoy was already in serious difficulty. It staggered on until 1553 when Edward VI formally closed it. The most ambitious hospital project in Tudor England lasted less than 50 years. The building survived longer. It eventually became a military barracks, then a prison, then various other things. The chapel, the Savoy Chapel, is still standing today just off the Strand in London, a few hundred metres from where the hospital once operated. The endowment that was supposed to fund care for the poor of London in perpetuity disappeared into the general disorder of the mid-16th century, which brings me to the dissolution and to the economic consequences of what happened when Henry VIII dismantled the monastic system between 1536 and 1541. The numbers again deserve to be heard clearly. By the mid-1500s, England had developed a network of approximately 800 hospitals and almshouses, many of them embedded within or dependent upon monastic institutions. They represented roughly 800 years of accumulated endowment land and property, donated by generations of kings and bishops and merchants and guilds, generating annual income that funded the care of the sick and the old and the poor. When the monasteries were dissolved, that accumulated endowment was seized by the Crown. Not all of it reached the poor it had been designated to support. A substantial portion was sold off to private buyers, the great land sales of the 1530s and 1540s that made fortunes for the gentry families who purchased former monastic estates at favourable prices. Some was retained by the Crown. A portion was redirected to the handful of hospitals that survived the dissolution by reforming themselves as lay charitable corporations, St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas's, St. Mary of Bethlehem. But for the majority of the 800 or so institutions, the smaller hospitals, the guild almshouses in provincial towns, the modest foundations that depended on their monastic connections for both administration and income, the dissolution was simply the end. The doors closed, the residents were put out, the endowment income was redirected, and on a winter morning in the 1530s or 1540s across dozens of communities in England, an elderly man or woman who had lived in a charitable institution for perhaps a decade stood outside a closed gate with nowhere to go. What replaced the system? In the short term, largely nothing. The period between the dissolution of the monasteries and the development of the Elizabethan poor law system, roughly 1540 to 1600, represents one of the bleakest chapters in English social history. The infrastructure that had, for all its imperfections, provided some form of minimum care for the most vulnerable members of society was gone. The poverty that resulted was visible, alarming, and politically destabilizing. The Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, the Act for the Relief of the Poor, which established the parish as the basic unit of public welfare and created the system of poor rates, was in large part a response to the vacuum left by the dissolution. It was a secular replacement for a system that had been religious, a state-administered replacement for one that had been charitable. It was also almost immediately inadequate. The workhouses and poorhouses that developed under the poor law system were in many communities more punishing and less humane than the medieval institutions they had replaced. The historians who have studied this transition most carefully tend to reach conclusions that feel uncomfortable. From a modern perspective, the medieval system, for all its theological baggage and all its genuine flaws, provided care of a quality and a humanity that the early modern secular replacement often failed to match. That is not an argument for the return of medieval theology. It is an argument for taking seriously what was lost. There is one final financial detail I want to share before we move forward, because it encapsulates the whole strange, complicated story of medieval hospital economics in a single image. In the archives of several English hospitals and almshouses, historians have found documents recording what happened to the institutional plate, the silver candlesticks, the gilt chalices, the embroidered vestments, the accumulated treasures of generations of wealthy donors who had given these beautiful things to the house in God's honour. In the years leading up to the dissolution, many of these institutions quietly sold their plate. Not out of corruption, out of necessity. The income from their estates was no longer sufficient to maintain the institution at the level required by their statutes. The endowment which had seemed perpetual was eroding, and so they sold the candlesticks. They melted down the gilt. They converted the beautiful things into coin, and used the coin to buy bread and ale and fuel for the people they were still for a little longer responsible for. The beautiful things went last. The care came first. I find that enormously moving, and I think it tells you more about the actual values of these institutions beneath the theology, beneath the transactional structure, beneath the complicated economics of salvation, than any founding charter ever could. We have now seen the full financial architecture of this world, the indulgences and the confraternities and the guild endowments and the corrodies, and the great royal foundations and the disastrous dissolution that brought so much of it crashing down. But there is one more chapter in this story that we have not yet told, one that touches every other part of this history and changes how you see all of it. It is the story of the rules, not the broad statutes we have mentioned, but the specific granular, sometimes astonishing rules that govern the daily behaviour of residents and patients in these places. Rules about noise and movement and relationships and dress and prayer, and what you were permitted to say and to whom and at what hour. Because in the world of the medieval hospital and almshouse, the rules were not peripheral. They were the architecture of daily life itself. And some of them are going to make you laugh. Some of them are going to make you wince. And at least one of them is going to make you think very carefully about the difference between an institution that controls people and one that genuinely cares for them. That part of the story is beginning right now. Every institution that has ever housed human beings has somewhere in its records a list of things those human beings were not supposed to do, and somewhere alongside that list, in the margin of an account book, in the cramped handwriting of a disciplinary report, in the careful Latin of an episcopal visitation, is the evidence that they did them anyway. This is the part of medieval hospital history that the founding charters never intended to preserve. These statutes were written to describe ideal behaviour. What the complaint records and visitation reports and disciplinary proceedings document is actual behaviour, and the gap between those two things is as it has always been in every institution from the monastery to the modern office, where the most interesting human material lives. So let us spend some time in that gap. The rules that governed medieval hospitals and almshouses were extensive, detailed, and in some cases so specific that you have to wonder what incident prompted them. There is a principle that historians of medieval institutions sometimes invoke informally. The rule that appears most precise is almost always the rule that was most frequently broken, because you do not write 7 careful lines specifying exactly what counts as excessive noise, at what hour and what the penalty is for each offence, unless the problem has come up often enough to require that level of specification. With that principle in mind, consider this clause from the statutes of a 13th century English almshouse, which I am paraphrasing from the original Latin residents, are forbidden from playing dice or any game of chance within the precincts of the house, whether for money or for other stakes at any hour of the day or night. Any hour of the day or night. The specificity suggests that the drafters had found people gambling in the dark after Compline, when they were supposed to be asleep, and decided that the prohibition needed to cover that contingency explicitly. Medieval hospital residents were gambling in bed after lights out. I find this completely charming and entirely unsurprising. The same statutes typically prohibited cards as well, though cards arrived in Europe only in the late 14th century, meaning that earlier prohibitions focused on dice knucklebones and various other games of chance that required no equipment more sophisticated than a few small stones and a willingness to wager. What were they wagering? Their bread allowance in some documented cases, their weekly ale allocation, small coins from whatever personal funds they had. In at least one recorded instance from a French almshouse, a resident was caught wagering his annual cloth allocation, the fabric he was supposed to use to make his winter garment, in a dice game against a fellow resident. He lost, and then had to petition the master for a replacement cloth allocation, which required explaining how the original had been lost. The master's response unfortunately is not recorded, but one imagines it was not warm. Gambling was relatively minor on the scale of institutional infractions. Let us move to something that generated considerably more official anxiety, the question of relationships between men and women within and around these institutions. Medieval hospitals and almshouses were, as a rule, mixed-sex institutions, men and women residing or receiving care in the same building, separated by ward arrangement and by the strict behavioural codes of the institution, but in daily proximity in ways that the founders were acutely aware created the conditions for exactly the kind of human attachment and complication they most wanted to prevent. The rules addressing this were both extensive and in their specificity revealing. Male residents in most institutions were forbidden from entering any area designated for female residents and vice versa. Visiting between wards required the explicit permission of the master or warden, and was typically limited to daylight hours in the presence of a third party. Any form of physical contact beyond what was strictly required by the provision of care was prohibited. And yet, the visitation records, those remarkably candid internal audit documents we have discussed before, contain with some regularity reports of exactly the kind of entanglements these rules were designed to prevent. At the Hospital of St. John in Ely, a visitation from the early 14th century recorded that one of the male residents had been found to have formed what the report described as an unsuitable attachment with a woman from the town, not a resident but a visitor who had apparently been permitted entry through the gate on a regular basis, under circumstances that the porter had failed to question with sufficient rigour. The male resident was warned formally. The visitor was banned from the premises. The porter received what the record describes as a sharp admonition, which is in the dignified Latin of a formal ecclesiastical document, about as close as you get to being told you've made a significant error of judgment. What I find notable about this case is not the infraction itself, which is entirely human and understandable. It is the specificity of the blame distribution. The resident, the visitor, and the porter all received different portions of official displeasure calibrated to their respective roles in allowing the situation to develop. Someone sat down and thought carefully about exactly who was at fault and in what degree. Medieval institutional governance at its most functional was nothing if not thorough. Now, the question of what happened when a resident died. This is a rule cluster that most people never think to ask about, and which reveals something genuinely important about how these institutions understood the relationship between the individual and the community. When a resident of a medieval almshouse or hospital died, what happened to their possessions? The answer in most institutions was, it depended on what kind of possessions they were and how they had come to be in the person's room. Personal items that the resident had brought with them upon admission, clothing, small tools, devotional objects, any modest jewellery typically passed to their next of kin, if they had any, and if those relatives could be found and were willing to claim the items. If there were no relatives, or if the relatives did not respond within a specified period, the items became the property of the institution. But here is the interesting part. Any items that the institution had provided the gown or robe that mark the resident as belonging to that particular house, the bedding, the small furnishings of the individual room, those returned immediately to the institution's inventory upon death. And in many statutes, the room itself was to be aired, the bedding washed, and a new resident admitted within a specified number of days. The bed did not sit empty out of respect for the dead. There was almost always someone waiting for it. There is a practical reality there that is somewhat uncomfortable to confront directly. The institution genuinely mourned its dead masses were said for their souls. Their names were entered into the obituary record, prayers were offered on the anniversary of their passing. The care was sincere, and the room was cleaned and the new resident admitted within the week. Both things were true, and the institution was not being callous. It was being what it had always been, a resource carefully managed, extended as far as it could reach to as many people as it could serve. Let me tell you about the hierarchy within the wards, because this is another dimension of institutional life that the founding charters tend to flatten into a single category called the poor or the infirm, but which in practice was considerably more stratified and socially complex. In most larger almshouses and hospitals, the residents were not equal in the everyday sense of that word. Seniority mattered. Length of residence conferred a particular kind of informal status that governed in ways both acknowledged and unspoken access to the best spots near the fire, the least drafty positions in the ward, the first choice of seat at communal meals. A resident who had been in the house for 20 years occupied a fundamentally different social position than one who'd arrived last month. They knew the rhythms of the institution in their bones. They knew which master you could approach about a grievance and which you could not. They knew the cook's name and the laundress's name and the particular hour at which the porter was most likely to be lenient about the curfew. That knowledge was a form of power, and it was used accordingly. The documents that capture this most vividly are again the complaint records, because senior residents sometimes use their status not merely for their own comfort, but to make life genuinely difficult for newer arrivals. A fascinating case from a 15th century English almshouse records a formal complaint brought by a group of newer residents against two long-established brothers who had over a period of years systematically claimed the warmest sleeping positions in the ward, the largest bread portions at meals, and the most convenient seats in the chapel, not by any formal right, but by sheer accumulated authority, and the willingness to make life unpleasant for anyone who challenged them. The complaint was investigated. The master found in favour of the newer residents. The two senior brothers were formally admonished and required to share the good positions more equitably. What I love about this case is the process. The newer residents knew they had the right to complain. They exercised that right through the institution's formal mechanisms. The complaint was taken seriously and adjudicated. The outcome was at least in principle fair. The medieval hospital was not a democracy. But it was not a place where power operated entirely without accountability either. The rules cut both ways. They constrained the residents, yes, but they also constrained those who ran the institution and those who dominated within it. The rules about work are another area where the historical picture is more complicated than the image of charitable housing might suggest. In most medieval almshouses, residents were not simply passive recipients of care who spent their days in prayer and rest. They were expected to contribute labour to the functioning of the institution according to their physical capacity. The specific tasks varied by institution and by the individual residents' abilities. Able-bodied residents might be expected to help in the garden, to assist with the laundry, to help carry supplies from the gate, to assist the staff in minor tasks related to the care of less able residents. The older and more infirm a resident was, the fewer labour obligations they carried. But the principle that membership in the community came with a contribution to the community was embedded in the statutes of most institutions with some regularity. This had an interesting effect on the social dynamics within the house. Residents who were well enough to work occupied a slightly higher position. In the informal hierarchy, they were visibly contributing, visibly useful, visibly not merely consuming the institution's resources. Residents who were too ill or too old to contribute anything were in the most honest analysis of the dynamics, dependent in a way that carried its own social weight. The able helping the unable within the same institution, funded by a founder who required prayers from all of them. It was a complete little economy, with its own labour relations, its own status gradations, its own internal politics. I want to share one more category of Rule 1 that I think captures something essential about what these institutions were genuinely trying to achieve underneath all the theology and the economics and the institutional machinery. The rules about speech. Most medieval hospital and almshouse statutes contain detailed provisions about how residents were to speak to one another, to the staff and to visitors. The prohibition on quarrelling we have already mentioned, but the rules went further than that. Blasphemy, taking the name of God in vain, swearing by the saints in anger, was specifically prohibited in virtually every institution's statutes and carried formal penalties. At some institutions, the penalty for a first offence was a period of reduced food rations. A second offence might mean a day's total fast. A third might mean formal expulsion proceedings. Slander, making false accusations against fellow residents or staff members, was treated with similar seriousness. Not because the institutions were protecting reputations in a modern sense, but because in a small community of people living in enforced proximity, slander was understood as a genuine threat to the social fabric that made communal life possible. And then there is the rule I mentioned at the close of the last part, the one that makes you think. At several English hospitals and almshouses, the statutes contain a provision worded in various ways, but consistent in its intent that residents are forbidden from speaking words of despair about their condition, from expressing in public a wish that they were dead, or that their suffering would simply end, from saying in the hearing of their fellow residents that there is no hope. The reason given in the documents that explain the prohibition is pastoral. Such words distress the other residents who are themselves struggling and make the burden of their own condition heavier. But read it again a little more slowly. An institution that had to write a rule against despair was an institution that heard despair regularly enough to feel the need to address it. These were not rules invented for hypothetical situations. They were responses to real voices saying real things in real rooms at the end of real days. The medieval hospital, for all its prayer and its canonical hours and its carefully managed daily routine, could not banish suffering. It could only try to hold it collectively in ways that made it slightly more bearable. The rule against despair was not a prohibition. It was in its clumsy institutional way an acknowledgement that despair was there, and a collective commitment to not let it spread unchecked. I find that more moving than almost anything else I have found in this entire research project. Can I ask you something genuinely? If you had been a resident in one of these places, let us say you were an elderly craftsman in a guild almshouse in 14th century London 2 years into your residence, what rule do you think you would have found hardest to keep? The gambling prohibition when the evenings were long and quiet, the curfew when the summer evening stretched past the gate closing hour, the silence after compline, when you had something you desperately needed to say to the person lying in the next bed, or the rule against despair on the days when despair was the most honest thing available to you. I think about this, and I think the answer would have been different depending on the day, which is perhaps the most human thing about these institutions. The rules were written for idealized residents. The actual residents were people, and people in every century find the rules that constrain them most painfully are the ones that press most directly against what they most need in a given moment. We have been inside these walls for a long time now. We have seen the wards and the gardens and the accounts and the complaint records and the gambling in bed after dark and the senior residents hoarding the good spots near the fire. What we have not yet fully confronted is the dimension of these places that was perhaps for the people who lived and worked and died inside them the most present reality of all, the ending. Because for many residents of medieval hospitals and almshouses, the institution was not a stop along the way. It was the last place. And the way these institutions thought about death, how they prepared for it, how they marked it, how they held the dying person in their final hours, and how they treated the people left behind is a chapter in this story that deserves its own careful attention. And it is the chapter we're entering now. Of all the things medieval people thought carefully about, and they thought carefully about more than we usually give them credit for, death was the one they thought about most, not with the avoidance and euphemism that characterizes most modern encounters with mortality, not with the clinical detachment that modern medicine sometimes reaches for when the treatments have run out, but with a directness, a ritual specificity, and a communal investment that made the act of dying something that happened not to an individual alone but to an entire community simultaneously. In a medieval hospital or almshouse, death was not an interruption of life. It was woven into the fabric of every day. And the question the medieval world asked with genuine urgency, with generations of accumulated theological and practical thought behind it, was not whether you would die. That was settled. The question was whether you would die well. There was a phrase for it. Ars moriendi. The art of dying. In the early 15th century, around 1415, give or take a decade depending on which version you are discussing, a set of texts began circulating across Europe under this name. They were practical guides. Manuals essentially for how to die in a manner that honoured God, settled the soul, and prepared the dying person for what came next. The longer version was a substantial text addressing in detail the temptations that assailed a dying person in their final hours, the temptation to lose faith, the temptation to despair, the temptation to attachment to earthly things, and providing specific prayers and responses for each. It also addressed with equal specificity how the people gathered at the bedside should behave, what to say, what not to say, how to offer comfort without offering false hope. The shorter version, the one that spread most widely, that was copied and translated into every major European vernacular, that found its way into the hands of hospital masters and parish priests and educated lay people across the continent, was considerably more compact, practical, usable in real time by real people at a real bedside. This is important to understand. The Ars Moriendi was not a philosophical text for scholars. It was a how-to guide for ordinary people facing an ordinary death. And in the context of a medieval hospital where death was a regular presence, where the staff had seen it many times before, and the long-term residents had watched neighbours die in the adjacent beds, it represented a kind of institutional literacy about mortality that we have almost entirely lost. Let me walk you through what actually happened in a hospital or almshouse when a patient was recognised as dying, not merely ill, not temporarily declined, but dying past the point where the infirmarius's twice-daily visits were about adjustment and monitoring, the point at which the visit had a different quality to it, a different weight. The sequence was fairly consistent across institutions, varying in detail, but consistent in structure. The first step was confession. We mentioned in an earlier part of this series that physicians sometimes refused to treat patients who had not confessed, and that this reflected a genuine belief that spiritual and physical health were inseparable. At the moment of recognized dying, this requirement became absolute. A priest was summoned to the bedside. Whatever had been unconfessed, whatever burden of sin the dying person was carrying needed to be laid down formally before anything else could proceed. This was not experienced as bureaucratic. It was experienced as essential. In the medieval understanding of what came after death, dying without having made your peace with God was not simply sad. It was catastrophic, a soul unprepared entering purgatory with an avoidable weight of unresolved sin. The priest who came to take the confession was not fulfilling a formality. He was performing in the eyes of everyone present the most important service that could be offered. After confession, the viaticum, the final reception of the Eucharist, the consecrated bread that was in Catholic theology, the body of Christ. The word viaticum means in Latin provisions for a journey. The Eucharist given to the dying was not a symbolic gesture. It was understood as literally sustaining the soul for the journey it was about to undertake. Then extreme unction. The anointing of the sick with consecrated oil on the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the hands, the feet. Each anointing accompanied by a specific prayer that named the sense being anointed and asked for God's mercy in relation to whatever sins had been committed through that sense. It was a thorough and careful ritual, and it was in the ward of a medieval hospital, conducted in full view of every other resident in the room. The candles. I want to spend a moment on the candles because they matter more than they might seem. When a patient in a medieval hospital was in their final hours, candles were lit at the bedside. Not for practical illumination, there was sufficient light for that by other means. The candle served a function that was simultaneously symbolic, and within the theological framework of the time practically effective. Candles represented in medieval Christian symbolism the presence of Christ, the light in the darkness, the illumination of the soul's passage. A candle burning at the bedside of the dying was an assertion that the person was not dying alone, that a light accompanied them. In some institutions the candle burned was specifically a blessed candle, one that had been consecrated at Candlemas, the feast of the presentation of Christ celebrated on the 2nd of February. These candles were kept throughout the year precisely for this purpose. Their consecration gave them in the belief of the time a protective and guiding quality that ordinary candles did not possess. And when the death occurred, when the breathing stopped and the person was gone, the candle continued to burn. For a specific period varying by institution, sometimes an hour, sometimes through the night. It was not left burning because no one had thought to extinguish it. It was left burning deliberately, a practice of witness. an acknowledgement that the moment of death was not an ending that could simply be moved past, that the space needed to be held even briefly before the practical work of what came next could begin, the passing bell. If you've ever read any English literature set before about 1800, you have probably encountered a reference to a bell being rung when someone died. In rural settings, in Dickens, in earlier poetry, the bell that announces a death in the community. In medieval hospitals and the towns around them, this bell was called the passing bell, or sometimes the soul bell, and its ringing was a specific signal with a specific community obligation attached to it. When a hospital patient was at the very threshold of death, not yet gone but actively dying, the bell in the hospital chapel was rung in a specific pattern that the community recognized, and the purpose of that ringing was not merely to inform, it was to call people to pray. The theory was direct and sincere. The soul at the moment of departure from the body was particularly vulnerable. The prayers of the living offered at precisely that moment could help it on its way. Every person in the hospital, every resident, every member of staff, every passing visitor within earshot was expected to stop what they were doing and offer a brief prayer for the soul that was at that moment leaving. The passing bell created a community of prayer around a single dying person. For a few minutes, the ward, the chapel, the kitchen, the garden all oriented themselves toward one bed and one soul. I find something genuinely beautiful in that, and something that in its own way addresses one of the deepest human fears about dying, the fear of dying without being noticed, of slipping away while the world continues its business without pause. The passing bell made the world pause now. What happened after the death? The body was washed and wrapped. In most hospital statutes, this was performed by specific designated people, often the women of the community, whether lay sisters or designated female staff. It was understood as a final act of care for the person, an extension of the bodily service that had been offered throughout their illness. The body was then carried to the hospital chapel where it lay until burial. The time between death and burial varied typically 1 to 3 days, depending on the season, the circumstances, and the availability of burial space. Prayers were said over the body continuously in many institutions. The night before burial, a vigil was kept. Someone remained in the chapel throughout the night hours praying, ensuring that the body was not left entirely alone in the dark. Then came the burial itself. In a hospital with its own chapel and grounds, this typically meant interment in the hospital's own cemetery or churchyard. In smaller institutions without dedicated burial space, it meant an arrangement with the nearest parish church. And after the burial, the months mined. On the 30th day after a death, a special mass was said for the soul of the deceased, a formal acknowledgement that 30 days had passed and that prayer for this person's passage through purgatory was still appropriate and important. And then the years mined. On the anniversary of the death, another mass, another formal prayer. The name read aloud from the obituary roll, the institutional record of everyone who had died within these walls. Every name, every year, not forever in most cases, but for a generation, sometimes 2. Long enough that the person died not once but continued to be named and prayed for until the community that had known them was itself gone. There is a particular kind of relationship that develops between long-term residents of any institution and the regular presence of death. Historians who have studied medieval hospital communities have noted with some care, because the evidence is fragmentary, that long-term residents of hospitals and almshouses developed what we might now call a practical relationship with dying that was qualitatively different from the experience of people who encountered it only rarely. In a ward where you might live for 5 years, 10 years more, where you had watched perhaps dozens of fellow residents go through the sequence we have just described, the process of dying became not normal exactly, but familiar, known. something you had witnessed often enough to have a relationship with that was not primarily characterized by terror. This does not mean the residents became callous. The complaint records we examined in the previous part include cases where residents objected to the way a dying neighbour was being cared for, where they raised formal protests about insufficient attention at the bedside, about candles not being lit, about the priest not being summoned promptly enough. People who had lived alongside someone for years and watched them die cared about the quality of that dying. They had opinions about it. They expressed those opinions through whatever institutional mechanisms were available. The medieval hospital resident facing their neighbour's death was not a detached observer. They were in many cases a veteran of this particular passage, someone who knew what it was supposed to look like, and who felt with the authority of that knowledge that the institution owed the dying person a certain standard of care. I want to tell you about something specific that appears in the records of several medieval hospitals, a practice that is, once you know about it, both simple and quietly extraordinary. In some institutions, when a patient was clearly in their final hours and unlikely to regain consciousness, a fellow resident, someone who knew them, who had lived alongside them in the ward, was permitted to sit at the bedside. Not a staff member, not a priest or a religious professional, just a neighbour, someone who had eaten at the same table, heard the same bells, complained about the same cold winters and the same quality of the ale, someone who simply by being there ensured that the dying person was not alone in their last hours. The formal records do not always tell us whose idea this was, whether it was written into the statutes from the beginning, or whether it evolved from practice residents simply beginning to sit with the dying because it seemed like the right thing to do until the institution formalized the permission. But it was there, documented, part of how these places worked, and it strikes me every time I return to this detail as one of the most human things in this entire story. Not the theology, not the economics, not the rules and the complaint records and the accounting for bread and ale and firewood. Just a person sitting at a bed, keeping someone company in the part of life where company matters most. The medieval world had a phrase for the desired outcome of all this preparation, all this ritual, all this communal attention. Mors bona, the good death. And the good death was not defined by the absence of pain. Medieval medicine could not reliably provide that. It was not defined by resolution of all earthly affairs, though that was desirable. It was not even defined by recovery, obviously. It was defined by readiness, by a soul that had been given the time and the support to face what was coming with its accounts settled and its faith intact, by the presence of community at the threshold, by the candle lit and the prayer said and the bell rung and the name eventually written in the obituary roll and read aloud once a year by someone who had known you. The medieval hospital at its best was built to make that possible. And here is the thing about the aspiration, the thing that makes me come back to it even after everything else we've discussed in this series, all the corruption and the cramped beds and the shared wards and the harsh rules and the financial crises and the plague years. It is an aspiration that still makes sense. The specific theology behind it is not one that everyone shares. The specific rituals have changed almost beyond recognition, but the underlying idea that dying is something a community does together, that the dying person is owed presence and care, and a form of witness that says you matter. Your passing is noted. The world pauses for you. That idea is not ancient. It is still what we are reaching for, still what we sometimes manage and sometimes fail to provide. In just a moment, we're going to step back from the individual experience of dying inside these walls and look at something larger, at what happened when the whole system that had housed and cared for people through illness and old age and dying was suddenly deliberately dismantled. Because the dissolution of the English hospital system in the 16th century was not just a political event or a religious event or an economic event, It was a human event. It had faces. It had specific people who woke up one morning to find that the institution that had been their home for years was closing its gates. And what happened to those people, and what eventually replaced what was lost, is a story that connects this medieval world directly to arguments we are still having today. It is the next thing we're going to look at together. Imagine receiving a letter that tells you the place you have lived in for the past 7 years is closing, not because it has failed, not because it ran out of money, or because a fire took the buildings, or because the community that sustained it scattered to the winds, but because a king decided, for reasons that had more to do with his marriage and his theology and his treasury than with anything related to you specifically, that the religious framework on which your home depended was being dismantled. You are 68 years old. Your hands shake in cold weather. You have not slept anywhere but this ward in 7 years. The person in the next bed has been your closest companion through 3 winters and 2 outbreaks of fever, and the death of a fellow resident you both cared about. The cook knows how you take your morning pottage. The porter knows your face, and now the letter says the gate will be locked by Michaelmas. This happened. Not as a hypothetical, not as a thought experiment. It happened to real people in real institutions across England in the late 1530s and through the 1540s as the dissolution of the monasteries ground forward with the systematic thoroughness of a royal administration that was very good at paperwork and not particularly concerned with the human details. We've already covered in an earlier part of this series the broad economic architecture of the dissolution, the 800 institutions, the seized endowments, the land sales to the gentry, the poor law that eventually emerged to fill some of the vacuum. I do not want to retread that ground. What I want to do now is something more specific. I want to take you to the moments where the dissolution met actual human resistance, where the people who stood to lose the most did not simply accept what was happening, but organised, petitioned, argued, and in at least one extraordinary case actually won. Because the story of the dissolution is not only a story of destruction, it is also a story of what people fight for when they know something irreplaceable is being taken from them. In the autumn of 1540, a man named John Leland was travelling through England on what he called an itinerary, a systematic survey of the country's antiquities commissioned by Henry VIII. Himself, ironically enough given what Henry's policies were simultaneously doing to the institutions Leland was documenting. Leland was a scholar, a careful observer, and what he saw in the English countryside during his travels was in many places the landscape of a recent catastrophe. He visited towns where hospital buildings stood empty, their roofs beginning to go. He recorded monastic infirmaries with their windows unglazed the weather, coming in freely, the floors already scattered with debris. He noted in his precise and melancholy way the names of institutions that had existed for 300 or 400 years and were now simply gone as buildings, as communities, as functional presences in their towns. At one site in the north of England, he recorded that the hospital had been the primary source of care for the sick poor of the entire surrounding district, a catchment area of perhaps 10 or 15 miles, and that since its closure, the poor have nowhere to resort in their sickness. Nowhere to resort in their sickness. 7 words, in Leland's careful, quiet, Latin-influenced English, and they carry the full weight of what the dissolution meant on the ground, in the lives of ordinary people who had nothing to do with the theological argument between Rome and the King of England, and everything to do with the question of whether there would be someone to help them when they could no longer help themselves. But London was different from the English countryside, and what happened in London specifically around the fate of its 2 great medieval hospitals is one of the most remarkable stories of citizen advocacy in the entire Tudor period. Let me set the scene. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in Smithfield had been operating since 1123, as we have discussed. By the 1530s, it was one of the most established charitable institutions in the city, embedded in the daily life of London in ways that 4 centuries of continuous operation had made structural. When the dissolution came, and the Augustinian priory to which St. Bartholomew's was connected was suppressed, the hospital's legal situation became immediately precarious. Its income, its staffing, its physical buildings, its entire institutional existence, all of it was tangled up with the religious foundation that was being dismantled. And then something happened that the royal administrators had perhaps not anticipated. The citizens of London decided they were not going to let it go without a fight. In 1544, a group of London's civic leaders, aldermen, prominent merchants, the Lord Mayor himself, organised a formal petition to Henry VIII, requesting that St. Bartholomew's Hospital be saved and refounded as a civic institution rather than a religious one. The petition is remarkable for its tone. It does not argue theology. It does not dispute the king's right to dissolve the monasteries. It is instead relentlessly practical, almost aggressive in its practicality. It describes in careful detail the number of sick poor people in London at any given time. It estimates the cost of their care. It outlines what will happen to the streets of London if there is no institution to receive them, not as a moral argument, but as a public order problem. Sick, desperate people with nowhere to go tend to become a visible, destabilizing presence in a city's public spaces. The petition suggests with a directness that seems almost pointed that this would not reflect well on the king's capital. Henry was by 1544 a sick man himself, gout-ridden, increasingly immobile in the final years of a reign that had been far more turbulent than he had ever intended. He was not entirely unsympathetic to the practical argument. He agreed to the refounding. In 1547, just weeks after Henry's own death, as it happened under the new regime of Edward VI, St. Bartholomew's was formally re-established as a civic hospital, administered by the City of London, funded by a combination of city revenues and private donations. It was no longer a religious institution. It was something new, a secular municipal hospital publicly administered, with a mandate to provide care for the sick poor as a civic function, rather than as an act of individual piety or monastic obligation. St. Thomas's Hospital in Southwark went through a similar process shortly afterward, refounded by the city in 1551 after years of closure and decay. These 2 refoundings matter enormously in the history of healthcare, because they represent in miniature the shift from the medieval model of charitable care, private religious, dependent on individual benefactors and institutional endowments, towards something closer to what we would recognize as public health care. Care provided as a civic function funded by something like taxation, administered by secular authority. It was not the modern National Health Service. It was not even close to that. But the seed of the idea was there. The man most associated with the campaign to save St. Bartholomew's was a London merchant and chronicler named Richard Grafton. He was by profession a printer, one of the most significant figures in the early English printing industry, a man who had published English Bibles and royal proclamations, and whose connections ran through the heart of Henrician and Edwardian London. And he was furious about what was happening to the hospitals. Grafton was not a radical. He was not a reformer in any theological sense. He had navigated the religious politics of Henry's reign with considerable pragmatism. But on the question of the hospitals, he was uncompromising. He wrote in terms that are still forceful across 5 centuries about the moral failure represented by closing the institutions that served the sick poor, while the land they had stood on was sold to private buyers at favourable prices. His language, translated from the somewhat archaic English of the 1540s, comes down to something like this: "You have taken the endowments that generations of the faithful placed in trust for the care of the suffering, and you have converted them to private gain. This is not reform. It is theft from the poor. He was not wrong. And the fact that his campaign contributed to the successful refounding of St. Bartholomew's suggests that arguments made clearly and without theological complication, at the right moment to the right ears, can sometimes change what seemed like an irreversible course of events. Now, what happened to the institutions that did not have a Richard Grafton? To the hundreds of smaller hospitals, the provincial almshouses, the guild foundations in market towns that had no civic patron wealthy enough to petition the crown, and no strategic location that made their fate a matter of royal public relations, they closed, and in most cases closed completely. The residents were discharged. In the best documented cases, they received some small payment, a few shillings perhaps, or a modest one-time gift from the assets of the dissolved institution. In the worst documented cases, they received nothing at all beyond the knowledge that they needed to leave by a specified date. Where did they go? Historians who have studied this question carefully tend to reach the same honest conclusion. For many of them, we simply do not know. The dissolution dispersed people in ways that left very little documentary trace because the people it dispersed were the kind of people whose lives left very little documentary trace under any circumstances. The elderly, the poor, the chronically ill, the widowed and the disabled and the simply worn out. What we do know is that the decade between the major wave of closures in the late 1530s and the earliest effective responses from secular poor relief, roughly 1540 to 1550, represents a period of genuine social crisis in English towns and cities. Contemporary accounts from this period describe visible increases in the numbers of destitute people in public spaces, vagabonds. The documents call them a term that carried legal as well as social weight because the Vagabonds' Acts of the period made begging without a license a criminal offence. People who had been residents of closed charitable institutions, now unable to care for themselves and with nowhere to go, were in legal terms vagabonds. Subject to the same statutory responses, whipping, branding forced labour as career criminals and professional beggars. The cruelty of that is not subtle. There is a theological dimension to the dissolution that I want to address directly, because it shaped the replacement systems that emerged and is still present in transformed versions in debates about welfare and charity that we have today. The Catholic model of hospital care was built on a specific theology of merit. Works of mercy, caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, housing the poor, were believed to benefit the soul of the person who performed them. Charity was in part an act of spiritual self-interest. The poor person cared for was a vehicle of grace for the wealthy person providing the care. This theology, for all its transactional quality, had a practical implication. It made caring for the poor directly beneficial to the wealthy. The rich man who built and funded a hospital was doing something for himself as much as for the people inside it. Protestant theology emerging from the Reformation rejected this framework explicitly. Works of merit were in the Protestant view a corruption and attempt to earn through human action what could only be given by God's grace. Salvation came through faith, not through the careful accumulation of charitable credits. This was, theologically speaking, a clarification, a rejection of what reformers saw as a deeply confused and potentially manipulative system. But it had an unintended practical consequence. If caring for the poor no longer directly benefited the soul of the rich person doing the caring, if the theological incentive was removed, what motivated the wealthy to fund charitable institutions, the Protestant answer was Christian duty, gratitude for grace received, the love of neighbour for its own sake. These are genuine and sufficient motivations. Many people have acted on them generously and effectively throughout history, but they are less reliable than self-interest, and the record of the decades immediately following the dissolution suggests that in practice, the removal of the spiritual incentive coincided with a significant reduction in the flow of private charitable endowments into institutional care. The system that replaced the medieval model was thinner, harder, and less generous in its understanding of who deserved care. The Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, which we touched on briefly in an earlier part, represented the mature secular response to this problem. And it is worth spending a moment on what it actually was, because it is often discussed as though it was simply a replacement for the medieval system. It was not a replacement. It was something structurally different. The medieval system was built around institutions, buildings with walls and gardens and chapels and communities of residents. The Poor Law was built around a categorization of people. The deserving poor, the elderly, the disabled, those whose poverty was visibly not their own fault, were to be relieved. The undeserving poor, the able-bodied who were judged capable of work, were to be set to work whether they wished to or not. The workhouse that emerged from this framework was designed not primarily to care for its inmates, but to make relief sufficiently unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek it. The principle of less eligibility, that conditions inside the workhouse must always be worse than the worst conditions of free labour. Outside, it was not a regrettable failure of implementation. It was the deliberate design intent. Compare that to an almshouse that held a feast on the anniversary of the founder's death. That planted gardens, that allowed residents to keep a domestic cat. That developed, however imperfectly, a community of people who knew each other's names and argued about the quality of the firewood and sat at each other's bedsides when the end came. The comparison is not flattering to the modern successor. There is a question I want to sit with as we move into the final part of this story. How do we account for what was genuinely good in a system built on foundations we cannot endorse? The medieval hospital was built on a theology of merit that Protestant reformers correctly identified as having serious problems. It was sustained by financial mechanisms, indulgences, corrodes the economics of salvation that involved real distortions and real abuses. It was governed by institutions, the medieval church, whose record in this period is complicated in ways we have been honest about throughout this series. And within all of that, real people received real care. Real communities formed. Real acts of genuine human kindness occurred. The candle kept burning, the neighbour sat at the deathbed, the Lenten fish dispute resolved in the residents' favour. The foundations were flawed. The care was real. I do not know how to resolve that tension cleanly. I'm not sure it can be resolved cleanly. But I think it is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over, because the tension itself teaches something that good outcomes do not require perfect systems, and that the dismantling of imperfect systems does not automatically produce better ones. We are almost at the end of this journey. And in the final part, the part that is coming in just a moment, I want to bring you back to where we began, and then take you somewhere unexpected. Back to a building that has been standing since the 12th century. Back to a tradition that has continued for nearly 900 years. Back to the small piece of bread and the tiny cup of ale that are still offered without charge to any stranger who asks at the gate. And from there forward to the question that I think this entire series has been quietly circling from the very beginning. What do we owe each other, and what does the answer look like when we actually try to build it into stone and endowments and daily bread? The last chapter is waiting. There is a gate in Winchester, England, that has been opening every morning for nearly 900 years. Not the same physical gate, of course. Wood rots, iron rusts, stone is repaired and replaced, but the same gate in the meaningful sense, the same location, the same purpose, the same act performed day after day for 8.5 centuries without interruption. You walk up to it, you knock, or you ring the bell, or you simply present yourself, and someone inside asks what you need, and you say the wayfarer's dole, please, and they give you a small piece of bread and a tiny cup of ale, and they do not ask your name. They do not ask where you're going or where you have come from or whether you deserve it. They simply give it to you. because that is what the Hospital of St. Cross has been doing since the 1130s, because Bishop Henry de Blois established that practice when he founded the institution, and the institution has honoured it through every disruption and reformation, and war and social transformation that England has experienced in the 9 centuries since. We began this series at that gate, and I want to come back to it now at the end, not because it is the most dramatic place in this story, it is not, but because it is, I think, the most honest place from which to look back at everything we have seen. Let me tell you a few things about what survived, not just as historical relics, not just as tourist destinations, though some of them are that too, but as functioning institutions still doing in recognisable form the work that their medieval founders established them to do. The London Charterhouse, which we mentioned briefly earlier in this series, was founded as a Carthusian monastery in the 14th century, became one of the casualties of the dissolution under Henry VIII, and then in 1611 was purchased by a wealthy merchant named Thomas Sutton, who converted it into what he described as a school for the young and an almshouse for the old. The school eventually became Charterhouse School, one of England's most famous independent schools, which relocated in the 19th century. The almshouse stayed. Today, the London Charterhouse still houses approximately 40 residents. They're called brothers, in continuity with the original monastic language, though the residents are now men and women both in the extraordinary medieval buildings that have stood in Smithfield since the 14th century. The brothers live in individual apartments, eat communal meals, have a garden, have a chapel. They are, by the terms of the original foundation, elderly people of limited means who have led respectable lives and who have, in the language that connects directly to 800 years of institutional history, nowhere better to go. 40 people living in a medieval building in the heart of London, in an institution that has been continuously providing this service since 1611, in buildings that predate that by 300 years. If you visit, and you can visit, the Charterhouse is open to the public on certain days, you can walk through those medieval courtyards and understand in your body, rather than just your mind, that the past is not entirely past, that some things continue. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in Smithfield is still there, still operating. Still a working hospital, now part of the National Health Service, still on the same site where Rahir, the former court jester, founded it in the year 1123. 900 years of continuous hospital operation on the same site. 900 years during which the institution has been a monastic hospital, a civic hospital, a voluntary hospital, a wartime hospital, and now a National Health Service hospital. 900 years during which the medical understanding of what causes illness has been completely transformed multiple times. 900 years during which the legal framework, the religious framework, the economic framework, the social framework of English society have all changed beyond recognition. And through all of it, on that particular patch of ground in Smithfield, there has been a hospital. I find that genuinely staggering. And I think it tells us something important, something beyond the mere fact of institutional continuity, about the depth of the human need that these places were built to meet. The need does not change. The understanding of how to meet it changes constantly. But the need itself, the need to have somewhere to go when the body fails somewhere that will receive you, and try to help somewhere that will not simply leave you alone with what is happening. That need is as old as human community and shows no signs of becoming obsolete. Now, the hospice. This is the connection that I have been saving, because I think it is the most surprising and the most important thread running from the medieval world directly into our own. The word hospice comes, as you might expect, from the same Latin root as hospital hosps, meaning guest host stranger received in need. Medieval hospices were, as we discussed in the very first part of this series, places that received pilgrims and travellers, the dying and the destitute, with particular attention to those for whom cure was not possible. The word more or less disappeared from active English usage for several centuries after the Reformation. The institutions it had described were dissolved or transformed. And then, in the 1960s, a woman named Cicely Saunders did something extraordinary. She was an English nurse who'd become a doctor who had spent years working with dying patients, and had become increasingly convinced that the medical establishment of the mid-20th century was in a specific and important way failing them. Not because it lacked technical skill, but because it had forgotten perhaps, or deliberately set aside the understanding that dying is not merely a medical event. It is a human event, and the human dimensions of it, the pain management, the psychological care, the family support, the spiritual attention, the simple presence of people who are not pretending this was not happening, required systematic institutional attention. In 1967, Saunders founded St Christopher's Hospice in Sydenham, South London, the first modern hospice, the institution from which the entire global hospice and palliative care movement descends. She called it a hospice deliberately, knowing the history, drawing explicitly and consciously on the medieval understanding that care for the dying is a distinct vocation, requiring distinct institutions and a distinct philosophy, one that prioritizes comfort over cure, presence over intervention, the quality of the time remaining over the extension of time at any cost. The medieval hospital had known this. It had built its wards with the altar visible from every bed. It had kept candles burning. It had rung the passing bell. It had sent a neighbour to sit at the bedside. And 9 centuries later, a doctor-nurse who had studied that history decided that the modern world had lost something real when it lost that understanding, and built a new institution to recover it. There are now around the world more than 25,000 hospice and palliative care programs operating on the principles that Cicely Saunders drew partly from that ancient tradition. The medieval hospital system was dismantled. The insight that generated it came back. Let me tell you what else survived. In the category of things most people do not know, almshouses, not as a historical relic, as a living institution present in contemporary Britain in numbers that consistently surprise people when they first encounter them. There are currently somewhere in the region of 30,000 people living in almshouses across the United Kingdom. These are not all medieval buildings. Many almshouses were built in the Victorian era or later, and some are entirely modern construction. But a significant number of them are operating under charitable trusts that date back centuries, in some cases directly to medieval foundations. The Whittington Almshouse we discussed in an earlier part, the various guild foundations, the episcopal hospitals that survived the dissolution by reforming themselves as lay charities, these threads run sometimes with surprising continuity into the present. The Almshouse Association, which represents these institutions, estimates that around 1,100 separate almshouse charities are currently operating in the United Kingdom. 1,100, housing 30,000 people. In a country that has had a national health service since 1948, that has a comprehensive state pension system, that has publicly funded social care provision. In that country, 1,100 charitable institutions founded on the medieval model of community housing for the elderly and the vulnerable are still operating, still needed, still providing something that the state system, for all its reach, does not fully replicate. What is it that the almshouse provides that the state system does not ask the people who live in them? And the answers tend to cluster around the same things: community in a specific and irreplaceable sense, the knowledge that your neighbour knows your name, the garden, the shared meals in some institutions, the sense of belonging to something that has a history that has been doing this work for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. These are not trivial things. They are for many older people living alone in the 21st century exactly the things that are hardest to find and easiest to lose. The medieval founders built community as a structural feature of their institutions, not as an afterthought. And it turns out that community, unlike the theology that surrounded it, does not become obsolete. I want to come back to the question that has been running through this entire series, the one I named explicitly at the close of the previous part. What do we owe each other? The medieval answer was you owe the suffering person your presence, your bread, your prayer. You owe them the candle kept burning and the bell rung and the name read aloud each year. You owe them a bed that is not the street, a meal that is not nothing, a community that will not pretend they do not exist. The institution that delivered this was imperfect. It was compromised by the self-interest of its founders, by the corruption of its administrators, by the rigidity of its rules, by the genuine wrongness of much of its medical understanding. It excluded people it should have included. It enforced compliance in ways that denied individual autonomy. It sometimes prioritized the spiritual comfort of the wealthy over the physical well-being of the poor. We have been honest about all of that across 12 parts of this series. And yet, when I tried to think clearly about what the medieval hospital and almshouse system got right, what insights it carried that survived the theology and the economics and the institutional failures, I keep arriving at the same three things. First, that vulnerability is not disqualifying, that a person who can no longer care for themselves is not thereby diminished in their claim on the community's attention. That need in itself is sufficient grounds for response. Second, that care is a communal act, not merely a professional service, that the neighbour sitting at the deathbed matters, that the shared meal matters, that the garden and the passing bell and the name read aloud once a year matter, that the human being receiving care is not merely a body requiring intervention, but a person requiring witness. And third, that these things are worth building institutions around, that the impulse to care left to individual goodwill alone is insufficient, that it needs architecture, endowment, rules, gardens, a gate that opens every morning. Not because any specific institution will be perfect, none ever has been, but because the alternative, leaving the vulnerable to the mercy of purely private goodwill unstructured and unobligated, is worse. These three insights feel to me as alive and as relevant in the 21st century as they were in the 11th. The medieval world arrived at them through a theology we do not all share and expressed them in institutions we would not replicate. But the insights themselves are not medieval, they are human. Here is the last specific thing I want to tell you. There is a room in the London Charter House, the medieval almshouse in Smithfield, that still houses its 40 brothers today, that has been in continuous use since the 14th century. Not continuous use as a museum, continuous use as a room where people live and eat and sleep and age and eventually die and are mourned. 700 years of ordinary human life in one room. And in that room you can still see evidence of all of it. The medieval stonework, the modifications made in each subsequent century, the layers of habitation that accumulate in a space that has never been abandoned, never been converted to some other purpose, never been allowed to become merely historical. It is still simply a place where people live. When I think about what that means, 700 years of people waking up in that building, eating their meals, attending their chapel services, complaining about the quality of the ale, arguing about the best spot near the fire, sitting at each other's bedsides, I am struck not by how different they are from us. I am struck by how alike. The same needs, the same fears, the same desire to be part of something larger than their own individual struggle. The same hope that when the end came, it would not come to an empty room. We have travelled a long way together in this series. Through the wards of Canterbury and Paris and Winchester, through the leprosaria set apart on the roads outside medieval towns, through the almshouses with their gardens and their feast days and their gambling in bed after Compline, through the plague years and the dissolution and the extraordinary story of citizens who refused to let their hospitals die, through the wards where the passing bell rang and the candle burned and a neighbour sat at a bedside. Thank you for travelling with me. I mean that genuinely. This kind of history, the history of ordinary people in ordinary institutions, the history of what we built to care for each other in centuries when there was no safety net, but the one we made ourselves, this is not the history that makes the headlines or fills the textbooks. It is quiet history. The history of bread given at a gate and beds shared, and names written in an obituary roll and read aloud once a year by someone who wanted to make sure those names were not forgotten. But I think it is some of the most important history we have, because it reminds us that the questions we are asking now about care and community, and who deserves help and what we owe each other, and how we build institutions that actually work, are not new questions. They are very old questions. And the people who came before us wrestled with them, seriously built imperfect answers to them, and left us both the inheritance of those answers and the accumulated evidence of what happened when they got it wrong. That inheritance deserves our attention, not as a model to replicate, but as a conversation to continue. The conversation is still going. If this series has given you something to think about, a question you had not considered, a detail that stayed with you a moment, where you felt the distance between the medieval world and our own suddenly collapse into something recognizable, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment below, even if it is just one thing from these 12 parts that caught your attention. Those comments are what tell me that this kind of storytelling is worth doing. And if you have been falling asleep to these stories over the past hours, if your eyes are heavy right now, if the medieval wards and the passing bells and the wayfarer's dole are drifting pleasantly through the edges of your consciousness, then that is exactly what I hoped for. Let it go. Let the story settle. The gate of St. Cross is open. The bread is on the table. The candle is burning low. Sleep well. There are more stories waiting for you on the other side of the night.